Good. Oh, we got a feedback. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the State of Student Debt Virtual Summit. I already see so many of you. We have over 300 people and counting. We've had thousands of you sign up, and we're just so excited today to bring together lawmakers, advocates, experts, and borrowers from across the country.
Today, we're going to discuss some of the most important topics that matter to student loan borrowers like me and many of you on today's call. Of course, we're going to talk about how to take action to cancel student loan debt, which I know is really important to so many of us. And we're also going to dive into some other important topics, like how do we address racial equity issues in the higher education and student loan space? What's the impact of student loan debt on mental health? And something that's near and dear to our heart at Student Debt Crisis Center, what is the grassroots movement of everyday Americans taking action to address this problem? And at the end of both of our morning and evening sessions, we are going to host one of our student loan help clinics to help people understand their repayment options, loan forgiveness programs, and all of the really rapidly changing COVID-19 policy updates. So just a reminder, this event is a two-part event. We are now kicking off our morning session from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. Eastern. And then we'll be diving into an evening session between 5 and 9 p.m. Eastern time. So definitely stick with us for the morning session. And if you want, join us later for the evening session as well.
The State of Student Debt Virtual Summit is hosted by our organization and our team at the Student Debt Crisis Center. We are a nonprofit organization centering the needs and voices of borrowers and partnering with allies to impact public policy to end the student debt crisis once and for all. And I think you'll get a really great taste of what we do here at the center and get to meet a lot of our partner organizations and the lawmakers we work with. Importantly, we're a people-powered movement and we represent over 2 million supporters. And today we're just joined by so many great advocates, researchers, and more, and especially you in the audience that made time in your day to come learn how to fight against student debt, how to cancel student debt, and take care of your own debt situation. I want to extend a really special thank you to our Economic Justice Fellows, Brendan, Ryan, Samantha. We could not have done this summit without you, and a really special thank you to Sabrina Calazans from our team and our new executive director, Cody Hunanian, who will continue to lead Student Debt Crisis. Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere, but we are just growing and want to grow with you all. So we're just so excited. Thank you so much for being here. Please send your questions to us throughout this. We will try to get it during Q&A periods during our panels. And with that, let's get started.
I feel like I would have such a more carefree life if I didn't have $164,000 staring me in the face every single day. Don't let the moment pass without making wide, broad reform.
We are also continuing to call on President Biden to use his existing legal authority to cancel up to $50,000 in student debt. This pause has actually shown how important canceling student debt is to borrowers and to our economy.
Canceling student debt by executive action is one of the most effective ways President Biden can provide sweeping relief to millions of families, while helping to reduce the racial wealth gap and to lay the groundwork for an equitable and just long-term recovery.
All right, so we are really excited to get started today, and it is my distinct honor to introduce some of the most important leaders in the fight to cancel student loan debt. I'm honored to be joined today by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. Senator Schumer and Congresswoman Pressley are leading the fight in Washington to cancel student loan debt. And I'm sure many of you are aware of it. They're some of our most vocal allies. Senator Schumer introduced Senate Resolution 46, calling on President Biden to use executive action to cancel student loan debt. This has been one of the most important developments in our movement in years. Recently, the senator has joined student loan borrowers on the ground and through virtual town halls, just like this discussion, where he has energized those of us that want to create meaningful change. Congresswoman Pressley is one of dozens of lawmakers in the House who is a firm believer that student loan debt must be canceled. And so they have their own resolution calling on President Biden to take critical action. Also, Congresswoman Pressley is a firm believer that student debt is a racial equity problem, and she centers the experiences of borrowers of color in all the work that she does. I know personally from our work at Student Debt Crisis Center that the senator and congresswoman are deeply committed to this issue. And it is my pleasure to have them share their voice today. So first off, it's my privilege to introduce Senator Schumer. Senator, are you on the line?
I am. Can you hear me, Cody? Can you hear me? Yes?
Yes. Great, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Cody, for that very nice introduction. But much more importantly, let me thank you for the great work you've done and the leadership you've shown as the program director for the Student Debt Center. And I want to thank everybody. We have so many people on this Zoom, and thank you for letting me join your summit on the state of student debt. I'm thrilled to be here and grateful to every one of you who is fighting to make a difference. And of course, I want to thank my colleague in the House, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, for her inspiring work, advocating not just for student loan borrowers, but all working Americans who need a fair shake. And to all of you tuning in today, thank you so much for your leadership and your advocacy, for working tirelessly on behalf of student loan borrowers across the country. So I'm thrilled to join all of you to talk about this urgent issue. This topic is so important to me, and I believe there's never been a better time to take action. For generations, higher education has been called a ladder up into the middle class, especially for Black, Latino, and Asian Americans. This was certainly true in my family. Growing up, my family was middle class. So when I went to college, I struggled to pay my way through. But I was able to get out of college without debts, thank God. Tuition was so much lower. Room and board was so much lower. Without that freedom, I would not have been able to pursue my passion for public service. And like so many other students, I had to gear my career to pay back enormous amounts. I didn't have to, like so many others, have to gear my career to pay back enormous amounts of debt. The freedom I had is harder and harder to achieve today. For too many Americans, it's almost a given. If you want to earn a college degree, you have to take on mountains of student debt. So over the years, that student debt has become not a ladder up, but an anchor weighing Americans down, making it harder to start a family, buy a home, live with financial independence, and do the things that people would want to do. Instead, that payment, that monthly payment each month is a drain, not only on people's economic viability, but on their happiness as well. Student debt makes it harder, in short, to achieve the American dream. That sacred promise that if you work hard, if you play by the rules, then one day you're going to make it here in America. For too many, the dream sadly seems like a fantasy. Listen to this number. It's astounding. It's frightening. Over 43 million Americans hold more than $1.7 trillion in student loan debt. Roughly 1 in 5 of these borrowers is in default, damaging their finances and credit scores for years, if not decades. And the challenges are even worse for students of color. While the median white borrower will owe roughly 6% of student debt 20% after college, The median Black borrower will own a staggering 95% of their debt in that same time span, 20 years after college. That burden, oh, it just so slays me. It's unacceptable, it's un-American, and at the rate we're going, it's unsustainable. So with Joe Biden in the White House and Democratic majorities in the House and Senate, the time is now to take action against the burden of student debt and give student loan borrowers the long-sought relief they deserve. It's been a very hard year and a half for all of us with COVID, but I'm proud to say that in the face of immense difficulty, we have managed to secure a number of wins for student loan borrowers. In the American Rescue Plan, I pushed for tens of billions of dollars in financial relief for struggling universities, making sure at least half that funding went to student financial aid. We also made student loan forgiveness incurred between now and December 2025 tax-free, so that we don't give with one hand while taking away with the other. And more recently, I joined with my friend Senator Warren to push the Biden administration to extend the pause on payments and interest for all federal student debts from the end of this month all the way to the beginning of February for next year. The truth of the matter is that borrowers are not ready to begin making payments. And that's in a survey conducted by the Pew Charitable Trust this summer, and it reaffirmed that after all, 2/3 of student borrowers said they were not ready to start making payments this fall. So I'm glad the administration listened to our calls on these issues. This decision will go a long way to buying some more time for millions of student loan borrowers so they can find financial footing as we all recover from COVID-19. But of course, there's more that needs to be done. Students don't need their debt paused, they need it erased. Let me say that again. Students don't need their debts paused, they need it erased. And to that extent, the Biden administration has canceled debt this year. They've canceled about $9.5 billion to 500,000 borrowers who either had a borrower defense claims, have had total or permanent disability, or have been defrauded by an institution. It's a step in the right direction, I'll grant that. But in the grand scheme of things, it falls very short of what we wish to see. It covers only $9.5 billion of student debt from a total of $1.7 trillion held by borrowers, less than 1% of student debt. It's not enough, we need to do more. So that's why last year I teamed up with Senator Warren and Representative Pressley and so many others to champion our resolution, calling on President Biden to cancel up to $50,000 in student loans for each student. You've probably all read of the travails in the Senate and the House at trying to pass legislation with the intransigence of so many on the Republican side. Well, this doesn't need that. It's just a flick of a pen. With a flick of a pen, President Biden, on his own, without any congressional action or approval, could provide millions upon millions of student loan borrowers with a new lease on life. It would free these Americans to finally buy that house, save on the kids' education, get going on starting a small business or going into the profession that they desire and want to be in. In other words, it can unleash a wave of economic activity missing from our country today. And of course, this isn't just the right thing to do for our economy, it's the right thing to do in the fight for racial equity. And most importantly, our proposal for canceling student loan debt would benefit those who need help most. A study done earlier this year by the Roosevelt Institute showed that the largest share of debt cancellation dollars from our plan would go to families with the least wealth. So in the months ahead, I'll continue pushing the president to take action to cancel student loan debt. I believe he has the authority to do it right now. Elizabeth Warren and I have shown him strong legal arguments that the president has the authority, and we will not rest until we follow through on our promise to bring relief for millions of people. My friends, this is fundamentally a fight to restore the American dream in the 21st century. When more Americans are given a chance to pursue that American dream, it strengthens our economy and strengthens that sunny optimism that's been the core of our national identity for centuries, but is fading away now in good part because of the huge burden of student debt. We have a lot of work to do, but I'm confident that by working together, better days lie ahead. So thank you for listening to me. Thank you for being part of this. Make sure you contact President Biden and get all your friends and family and anyone else you know to contact the White House any way you do it, by phone or tweet or mail or whatever, you name it, and just let them know how much we need this. Now it's my honor to turn to my colleague, Ayanna Pressley from the great state of Massachusetts. Few in the House have worked as passionately and as tirelessly as she has to make the promise of student debt relief a reality, and I've been honored to stand with her in this great effort. I know with her fighting for the American people, we will get this done. Ayanna?
Thank you so very much, Leader Schumer. Grateful for your friendship and your partnership and your consistent leadership on this issue. It's been an honor to fight alongside you. And my sister in service from the Commonwealth, Senator Warren, and so many of my House colleagues who have been fighting the good fight on behalf of the millions of workers and families that are struggling and burdened by this nearly $2 trillion crisis of student loan debt. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to join you. It's an honor to sit at this virtual table with you. And I thank you for the work that you have done, for the foundation that you have laid that has made it possible for us to make the progress that we have been able to make. But as Leader Schumer enumerated there, we have much more work to be done. So I want to thank the Student Debt Crisis Center team for bringing us all together and for creating space for us to mobilize and organize for the future that we all want and deserve, a future free from the heavy burden of the $1.7 trillion student loan debt crisis. It is because of your relentless advocacy and partnership that we've never been closer to making that future a reality. We cannot and we will not let up. As my colleague, Senate Majority Leader Schumer mentioned earlier, we have a record number of more than 80 members of Congress joining us in our calls to urge President Biden to cancel $50,000 in federal student loan debt. This is evidence that momentum is growing and it is on our side. The people are on our side and the movement is on our side. Now, let me be clear. Student debt crisis has always been a racial and economic justice issue. But for too long, the narrative has excluded Black and Hispanic and Latinx communities and the ways in which this debt has exacerbated, deeply entrenched, and I would argue legislated, racial and economic inequities in our nation. These disparities didn't just magically appear. They are the consequence of generations of systemic racism, discrimination, and what I would characterize as policy violence, like redlining, which has systematically denied Black and Hispanic and Latinx families the opportunity to build wealth, forcing Black and Brown families to take on greater rates of student debt for the chance as the same degree as our white counterparts. The debt has compounded our gender and racial wealth gap. Black college graduates in their 30s have lost ground over 3 decades when it comes to building generational wealth, the result of student debt and sluggish income growth. Women carry more than 2/3 of all outstanding student debt. Black women in particular bear the largest burden as they are forced to take on higher student debt loads, all while navigating a persistent wage gap that allows Black women to earn just 61 cents to every dollar earned by a white man. And this is why I say that policy is my love language. People often talk about the role that Black women play on the ballot and at the ballot box, including as recently as the election which delivered this decisive Democratic majority. But you can save the accolades because policy is my love language, and Black women have been the most burdened by student loan debt. Now, this pandemic, well, and also I should add, I want to speak to what has also been happening to our Hispanic and Latinx brothers and sisters. These families have seen the largest increases in student loan debt over the last several years. This debt has hindered Black and Brown home ownership. It has stifled entrepreneurship, and it has even contributed to the growing mental health crises. This pandemic has made it all but impossible to ignore the fact that we can and we must take bold action to address these inequities and disparities and provide much needed relief to our communities. In the same way that these realities were legislated into existence, policymakers with the power of the pen can and must push for solutions that repair the harm that has been inflicted. Canceling student debt by executive action is one of the most effective ways that we can provide sweeping relief to millions of families. We can help reduce the racial wealth gap, we can stimulate the economy, and we can begin the groundwork for an equitable and just long-term recovery. A recovery not to a pre-COVID status quo, unjust normal, but instead a recovery that puts us on path to charting a more just and equitable society. Our communities simply cannot afford to make the same mistakes of the past. Take the 2008 financial crisis, for example, when lawmakers bailed out Wall Street and abandoned Black and Brown communities who lost everything. Many have yet to recover, and the ongoing economic challenges that have stemmed from the pandemic will only set our communities back even farther. So as we work to ensure an equitable recovery to the current crisis, we can't simply afford to tinker around the edges. We have to go as broad and as deep as the hurt is. Our nation's response must reflect the urgency of this moment and the lived experiences of our most vulnerable communities. We're seeing progress. Again, momentum is growing across the nation. More than 20 HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, have stepped up to the plate and invested federal COVID response funds to provide millions in student debt cancellation for their students. And this number is only expected to grow. They are pace setters, and President Biden should be following their lead. And for the record, the Biden administration has the clear authority to get this done. In the same way the president heeded your calls, our calls, and used his executive authority to extend the student loan payment pause, he should use this same authority to provide broad-based student loan debt cancellation. In the same way, the Biden administration provided more than $9 billion in student debt cancellation for those defrauded by for-profit colleges, veterans, and folks with permanent disabilities. The president should provide swift economic relief to millions of workers and families across the nation by canceling student debt with the stroke of a pen. The authority is there. The momentum is there. What's needed now is the political will to get this thing done. We can and we must act. Our communities deserve nothing less. So I applaud each and every one of you for joining this summit today, for learning and elevating your stories, and doing the work to make student debt cancellation a reality. Your lived experiences are so important because you have amplified your voices. This is now an issue of people throughout the country are clear that this is an issue of national consequence. So I stand ready to be your partner and your accomplice in good and in the pursuit of justice. Thank you. And I will kick it back to you, Cody.
Congresswoman, that was incredible. Thank you so much. And also thank you, Senator Schumer, for being another just unbelievable ally in this movement. I know when I started working on the issue, 7 years ago or so, a lot of people felt like, why aren't lawmakers hearing my voice? Now, not only do we have over 80 lawmakers that hear our voice, they're echoing our voices, and they're doing the fighting that needs to be done in the halls of Congress and at the White House. It's critically important. I just want to point out one great thing here. I see that we have over 630 people on today's call. I'm just asking folks, close your eyes for a second. Imagine a room of 630 people meeting in a rally to cancel student loan debt. This is an unprecedented showing. I know the pandemic has moved us to digital spaces and Zoom, but that doesn't make this any less impressive. And we're just happy to have these lawmakers here to speak to such a broad and large and diverse audience. So this is really great. Thank you everyone for joining. So now that we've got past our keynote addresses and remarks, which were incredible, we want to bring together today advocates and experts that really understand the issue and are doing some of the work to create change. And so this first panel today is going to be on the political fight to cancel student loan debt. Some of the things that Senator Schumer and Rep. Pressley just mentioned. So I want to introduce our first panelist, or panel of experts here. I have Kira Taylor. Kira, are you on the line?
I am. Good morning, Cody.
Good morning. Kira Taylor is a staff attorney at the National Consumer Law Center, one of the best allies that we have in this movement. They focus on student loans, particularly for those that need extra representation if they're lower income, they're fighting challenges. Prior to joining NCLC, Kira was a staff attorney at Harvard Law's Legal Services Center, where she worked in the project on predatory student lending, particularly focused on for-profit issues. And I think this is my favorite thing about Kira. Prior to becoming a lawyer, Kira was an elementary school teacher in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and East Harlem, New York. So I always appreciate that you come at this issue with the enthusiasm to educate folks, and that's been really helpful. So we're really happy to have you here, Kira. I also have here on the line Ella Azalea. Ella, are you on the line?
Yes, hello.
Hey, Ella. Ella is the program associate at Generation Progress, and Generation Progress is working on the issue of student loan debt really as far back as I can remember. At Generation Progress, Ella helps run the Higher Ed Not Debt campaign, which is a multi-organization coalition of advocates that work together consistently to address the many issues that impact student loan borrowers. Ella previously served as a field organizer for Elizabeth Warren's 2020 presidential campaign in Iowa, and there she utilized both traditional and digital organizing strategies. Ella, we're so happy to have you here with your digital organizing experience, because as I mentioned, the pandemic has so many of us online taking action. And last, to round out our panel here, we have Justin Atkins. Justin, are you on the line?
Hey, Cody, I'm here. How are you?
Hey, Justin, I'm doing great. So Justin is the current national political manager at Next Gen America, where he works on political strategy addressing the issues that impact young people. After serving in the United States Army, Justin first got involved in politics as a campus organizer while attending Florida Atlantic University. From there, he would go on to help elected progressive candidates throughout Florida. Justin is committed to building a pipeline to leadership and investing in the future for young people. And Justin, I just want to note, I got my start organizing students on campus. I bet a lot of us on today's call did. That's kind of the first step for anyone who wants to create change broadly. So I'm happy to hear that. So we brought these panelists together because these are some of the most effective advocates and experts in the space. Kira brings a legal perspective, Ella's a fantastic organizer, and Justin really has this base of volunteers and young people that want to make a difference. So just to get this panel going, I want to kind of lay the land. Kira, I'm going to pass it off to you because I know you've got some slides that kind of give us a rundown of who is impacted by student debt and how student debt cancellation would help them. So let me get those going here.
Thanks, Cody. And while you're getting that set up, I just love to say how thrilled I am to be on a panel with Ella and Justin and talking about all these issues and talking about how we fix the harms that have happened in the past and fix the system going forward. I will also warn you, I'm really fired up after listening to Senator Schumer and Representative Pressley. So it will only get more exciting from here.
Awesome, I'm pumped too. So I'm gonna share these slides and give us a quick background here.
All right. So when we're talking about the federal student loan crisis, I think we have to start with where it all started. Okay, so I have a picture here of President Lyndon Johnson signing the Higher Education Act into law. And I think it's really interesting that it was President Johnson who signed the Higher Education Act into law because he himself, as the story goes, went to college with only $75 in his pocket, and he had to work as a student custodian and a door-to-door sock salesman. You heard me right, a sock salesman, when he was going to school. And he had to live above the college president's garage to cut costs. He said in his speech when he was signing the Higher Education Act that sometimes he wondered what the next day would bring that could exceed the hardship of the day before. So for him, he was very optimistic about what opening up access to higher education could do for America and what would happen if we opened up a federal student loan system. So just to pull a little bit more of what he said when he signed it, he said, when you look into the faces of your students and your children and your grandchildren, tell them that you were there when it began. Tell them that a promise has been made to them. Tell them that the leadership of your country believes it is the obligation of your nation to provide and permit and assist every child born in these borders to receive all the education that he can take. Now, the Higher Education Act has opened up access to post-secondary education for millions of Americans. But as I've seen all of you saying in the chat, that access has come at a cost and has carried unintended consequences for millions of Americans and their families. I don't think that President Johnson could have imagined the cost that the very people he intended to benefit would bear as a consequence of what has happened in the federal student loan system. And I don't think that he could have predicted the exponential rise in the cost of tuition or that overall inflation just wouldn't keep up, right? So with that, I think now that we are rooted in the promise that was present when they passed the Higher Education Act, let's dive into where the data is today. So next slide. So where are we now? We've got 43 million borrowers, okay? 43 million borrowers. And let me tell you, these borrowers are as diverse as the American population. You name a profession, you name a job, chances are someone has to have either a degree or certification to get there. And I will tell you, in my work, I have talked to electricians and hairdressers, HVAC repairmen, plumbers, you know, everybody has student loan debt. If you're talking about it in the public, people would just come up to you and say, yes, this is my problem too. In fact, it's so pervasive that 1 in 8 Americans carry student loan debt. And I think this number is so important because you hear a lot of the haters talking about the $1.6 trillion, but I think we really need to focus on the 43 million lives that would be changed if we had broad-based debt cancellation. So let's keep moving. And I want to dive into who are these 43 million borrowers. And I'm going to tell you, I am going to provide a little bit of foreshadowing to what some of the other speakers are going to be talking about as well. But I think it's useful to think about our debt contextualized amongst the entire student loan portfolio. And you might be surprised as we dive into the numbers. So let's keep going. So let's start with borrower's age, right? So a lot of people assume that federal student loans are a young person's problem, but that is just not true. As you can see, it's about a 50-50 split. There are about 22 million federal student loan borrowers under the age of 35, and there are about 22 million over the age of 35. And within that 22 million over the age of 35, we have graduate students, we have parents who borrowed Parent Plus loans to pay for the college tuition of their child. And we also have the 4.5 million people who have been in repayment for over 20 years, okay? And I also think the crisis has become exponentially worse in the last decade. And so we will see more people who are getting older and are still carrying student loan debt. And it will endanger their ability to help their kids go to college. Like Senator Schumer said, this has a lasting impact on people's lives. Research has shown that when people have student loan debt, they think about delaying getting married. They think about delaying having kids. They can't afford a house. They can't afford to save for retirement. And it's really devastating to think about how this impacts people of all ages. This is not a temporary problem. And many people worry about carrying their student loan debt until they die. So let's continue on. Now, another thing, Senator Schumer and Representative Pressley already discussed this in their comments, that the system is unequal and the federal student loan system mirrors the systemic inequalities we have in America. So it's no surprise that 2/3 of federal student loan borrowers are women. And it's also no surprise that because of gender inequality in this country, women tend to borrow more than men, and they tend to repay for longer than their male counterparts. The American Association of University Women have done some really interesting research on this and have a fabulous report if you want to read a little bit more about that. Let's keep going. And another assumption that people have when we talk about student loan debt is that everybody completed their degree. Now, that's actually not true. Experts estimate that about 40% of borrowers didn't complete their degree or didn't get their certification. Now, the data here is incomplete, and this was an estimation that was based off of looking at folks who enrolled in 2012 and borrowed, and tracing to see who completed their degree within 6 years. So this is an acceptable number, but the bottom line here is that not everyone who's repaying the debt even got the benefit that was supposed to be associated with taking on the debt. Let's keep going. Now, I think this is really interesting. I am a student loan borrower and I am a high debt burden borrower, but it's interesting to see the debt across the board here. So 35% owe $10,000 or less, about 20% owe between $10,000 and $20,000. You can see the breakdown here. But what's really amazing is that any of the broad-based cancellation proposals on the table would have a profound effect on millions of Americans. Each one of those little people is a million borrowers, okay? So if we canceled $50,000, it would radically shrink the federal student loan portfolio. And before we move on, I want to talk about other folks with high debt, like me. Not everyone is like me. Not everyone went to grad school. I talked to plenty of folks who attended school 10 or 20 years ago, started with a small amount of principal, and it increased exponentially over time. And now they're looking at potentially a six-figure amount of debt. In addition, some folks are like me and did accrue a large amount of debt to go to grad school. And I actually think that that's okay, because we want the people in our professions, we want our lawyers and doctors and dentists to look like the American population and the American communities that they serve. So even though some of the haters will look at folks who have large balances and hate on them a little bit and use that as a justification not to do broad-based debt cancellation, don't be fooled. I think some of that is a little bit of smoke. In addition, I will also point out that there is a valid point that folks who are wealthy tend to borrow a lot of money, right? So they tend to borrow to go to graduate school, to go to law school, to go to med school, et cetera. But those programs are very expensive, okay? The average amount of law school debt, for example, done in a recent ABA survey in, I want to say 2021, was the average amount of law school debt was $146,000. Guys, those people are still going to be repaying, even if we do broad-based cancellation under the current proposals. If there's $10,000, if there's $50,000 discharged, those people are still going to be repaying. So it's not as though they're getting off scot-free. And overwhelmingly, the people that benefit are lower income folks, where getting that money back means that they're going to be able to pay for their life's expenses. So let's keep going. Now, let's talk about those wealthy people, okay? Because we're going to start with income and we're going to talk a little bit about wealth, and you're going to be talking about this later today, but I just couldn't resist because I think it's such a powerful statistic. So some researchers looked into the household income of federal student loan borrowers, and what you see here is that about 3/4 make less than $127,000 a year, and about 1/4 makes more than $127,000 a year. Now, these numbers are just numbers until we contextualize them. So I looked at the MIT living wage calculator, and across the board in every state in the country, just looking at expenses, right? Mandatory expenses. We're not talking about vacations or savings or anything else. If you are a 2-adult earning household and you have 2 dependent children, you have to make over $87,000 a year just to cover the bills. So against that number, when you're looking at the $127,000 a year, we're not talking about the Lamborghini owners, guys. These are people who might be able to take a vacation. They might be able to put some money towards retirement, but it's not as though there are conventional idea of what rich is, okay? And also, when you look at the MIT living wage calculator, you see that the cost of just covering basis expenses in our major metropolitan areas is substantially more expensive. So sometimes I think the economists who are trying to be helpful and are talking about the wealthy people who hold student loan debt, they're not actually talking about the really wealthy people. Another point on this is that income is not the same as wealth. So there are people who may be high income earners, but might be supporting all of their extended family, or they might have substantial medical debt. They might not have wealth. They may just be making money, and then that money sort of flows out to where it has to go to cover family's expenses, medical expenses, et cetera, right? So, and researchers at the Brookings Institute found that 70% 70% of federal student loan borrowers were either negative, zero, or low wealth, okay? And it's a truth worth speaking. Rich people, wealthy people don't borrow student loans, okay? So if we are going to do broad-based cancellation, the people who overwhelmingly win are low and middle income Americans. So let's continue on. Now, another statistic I just couldn't resist is, again, the reality that our systemic inequalities are reflected in our federal student loan system. And we see this in the statistics around Black families that hold debt. And this is indicative of the racial wealth gap that we have in this country, okay? So when you look at the wealthiest Black families, 43% are still having to borrow because they don't have that wealth to pull from. They don't have the family assets. And this is indicative of centuries of inequality. And we see it today. So I don't think we can ignore the people who have high incomes when we're thinking about broad-based debt cancellation, if we really want to fix the problem that's been created. And then let's continue on. One other really important statistic to remember about our federal student loan system is the amount of folks who go into default. And the reason why defaulting is so bad on your federal student loans is because you can face wage garnishment, you can have your tax refund offset, and you can have other federal benefits seized. And there's no statute of limitations. So this can happen indefinitely. And also, it's unbelievably difficult to discharge your student loans in bankruptcy. So basically, when you're hard up and you can't pay the bills, you're stuck. You don't have any options. And this is even worse in communities of color. Research by Ed Trust and the Brookings Institute show that I want to say the 5 times more Black borrowers default than white borrowers. The highest income Black borrowers are more likely to default than the lowest income white borrowers. It is terrible, okay? And the other piece is that Brookings researchers looked at what the community impact was, and they found that majority Black zip codes tended to have higher student loan borrowing rates and larger balances than majority white codes. They defaulted more, and that pulled more money away from their communities. This is not acceptable. So, Cody, we can pull down the slides. And I told you I get really worked up because it strikes me that the solution is so simple. Here, the government is the lender. We're not in the situation like we are with the foreclosure crisis or the eviction crisis, because there you're dealing with private entities. Here, the government is the lender. And experts at Harvard Law have demonstrated that President Biden does have the authority to cancel a portion or all of everybody's student loan debt. So we could make this better. And it's not going to be a panacea for all the problems, right? But at least it will make things better than where they are, because we are in a crisis right now. And we have an obligation to fix the problems that this system has created over decades. And we can do that. And now should be the time.
Kira, that was a lesson in some of the most important things we need to know. I feel like teacher Kira definitely came out. Before I bring everyone else into the conversation, I just want to take an opportunity for you to put your lawyer hat on. And, can you dive in just a little more clearly and explain what that legal mechanism looks like for President Biden in his ability to cancel student debt with the flick of a pen?
Absolutely. So when President Johnson passed the Higher Education Act, within the text of the Higher Education Act was a thing called Settlement and Compromise Authority. And the citation, if you guys want to feel really cool as you're debating other folks at home, is 20 USC 1082A6. And that part of the statute gives the president or the Secretary of Education the authority to settle or compromise on debts. Now, the Department of Education is discharging debt all the time under its Borrower Defense Authority, Closed School Discharge Authority, et cetera. And so the department accepts that it's going to act on a group basis. It's interpreted those authorities to allow it to act on a group basis. again, the experts at Harvard Law wrote a memo establishing that the president could use his settlement and compromise authority to discharge debt broadly across the student loan debt portfolio. And that makes a lot of sense, again, when you're thinking about the promise that was made to borrowers and to the American public when we created the Higher Education Act. President Johnson said, "I doubt that any future Congress will ever erect a prouder moment for future generations." Now, if we canceled this debt, I think that would be actually like delivering on that promise and making that pride a reality for millions of Americans.
Great. So I want to bring in Ella now. Ella, I don't know if you're watching the chat, but I'm seeing a ton of people, I think, state the obvious, which is I have a ton of student loan debt because my college costs so much. And so the two issues cannot be separated. I know you've got a couple of slides that kind of run us through the fight to make college affordable again. So let me bring those up, and I'd love for you to kind of connect the dots here as to why the two issues are so intertwined.
Thanks, Cody. Yeah, absolutely. So when we're talking about solutions to the student debt crisis, you're absolutely right. It cannot just be debt cancellation alone. We absolutely need to have a component of a solution that addresses the root cause of the issue, which is college affordability. And so that's why I see debt cancellation and free college as two sides of the same coin. These are both solutions that need to be implemented if we're really going to address and end the student debt crisis once and for all. And so just for some context of, how did we get to this point where college is so simply unaffordable? Basically, if you look back over decades, you'll see that federal and state governments in particular have steadily been decreasing their funding investments to colleges and universities over the years. And because higher education is considered discretionary spending in state government budgets, it's a budget item that can be cut. And so over the years, state governments have, like I said, invested less and less in colleges. And so because of that, colleges and universities needed to figure out a way to make up that lack of funding that they didn't have. And so they decided to externalize the costs, put that cost onto students and their families by increasing tuition. And so now you have skyrocketing tuition, students and families who are simply unable to afford those skyrocketing costs. And so the result is that students and families had to turn to student loans to keep up with those costs to be able to afford attending higher education. And so that's just something you can kind of see here in the two graphs on the screen. But if we can go to the next slide, you'll see a more specific example in the state of Louisiana. You can see over time, the blue line being cost of tuition increasing, while the state government decided to cut funding for colleges and universities over the years. So it's a direct cause and effect here. And if we go to the next slide, this will just give a little bit more to further contextualize this affordability issue. In addition to tuition skyrocketing, you also see at the same time, over the years, wages stagnate, and yet inflation and the cost of living have continued to increase. So while tuition and cost of a degree is skyrocketing, people simply are less and less able to afford. There's less money in people's pocketbooks to be able to afford a degree. But like Carrier said, it's crucial. People need a degree. So on the next slide, I'll just give a little bit more of similarly to what other speakers have said, we take a closer look at this crisis, and there are some groups of students who are simply more burdened than others, who are shouldering more of this crisis. And so they're being crushed by this debt more than others. And so when we're talking about affordability solutions, we need to center these people who are disproportionately burdened, the people who are least likely to be able to afford higher education. And because of those very same disparities that were mentioned earlier, we see disparities in opportunity, attainment, and outcome for by race and also by income. So we see systemic racism and historical factors are over several generations and still existing today, impacting who has student debt, like Kira said. And we should all take this into consideration as we're talking about solutions and how we approach the disparities in who's able to afford higher education. And so I'll just go to the next slide. Thanks. And so when we're talking about, the affordability issue, we also have to keep in mind that there are some institutions, such as for-profit colleges, who are preying upon people who just want a better life for themselves, who are seeking out higher education just to improve, their day-to-day lives, to improve the situation for them and their families. And like I said, there are some institutions like for-profit schools who are taking advantage of these borrowers, and disproportionately for-profit schools target Black and brown communities. They target low-income communities, and they're preying upon them by selling the dream of, hey, this degree will, improve your situation. You'll be able to buy a house or whatever it is they're promising. Meanwhile, it's often the case that these for-profit colleges are of low quality, have low quality programs. And so either the borrowers graduate with either a useless degree, or they don't have the skills that they need for their chosen career field, or they're left with credits that don't transfer, so useless credits. And like I said, these for-profit colleges are preying upon these communities and really misleading borrowers in terms of what they're getting. And so we have to keep this in mind as we're talking about affordability solutions, that some people, they're just getting the wool pulled over their eyes by these institutions. So next slide. Thanks. So as we're thinking about what are the components we need to consider when talking about a solution to the lack of affordability of higher education, well, we need to remember, like Kira said, who are the borrowers that are suffering most, and how is this going to impact us not only now, but over the next several years? And so we're starting to see that some of the decisions that, folks like myself, young people, we're having to take our student debt into consideration when we're making life decisions. But beyond deciding, am I able to move? Am I able to buy a house? Am I able to get married? Beyond that, there are plenty of students who also have to weigh, am I going to pay off my student loans this month? Or am I going to be able to afford some basic necessities? Like they choose whether they fall into default on their loans, or they choose, make choices while they're a student that, do I afford my textbooks, or can I pay for food this week? And so we need to also consider that it's not just tuition that's making higher education inaccessible for people. It's those other costs beyond tuition as well, such as food, housing, healthcare, childcare, transportation, books and materials for class, utilities bills. All of these things are part of the context of understanding why people can't afford a degree, why people can't afford to go to school. So just want to keep that in mind as we start talking about solutions in a second. Thanks, Cody. And so where are we at now? So there's some really exciting news on this front while we're talking about free college solutions. So we already have a few pieces of free college legislation introduced in Congress in both the House and Senate, which is amazing. And on top of that, the exciting news is that right now there's a process going on in Congress that could get us, in a few weeks, we could get free community college. That could be a reality. And this process is called reconciliation. And what that is basically the president introduces a proposed budget. Then the House and Senate budget committees both propose resolutions to set spending targets for the year. Then they both negotiate until both the House and Senate can reach an agreement. Then after that, they have to pass an omnibus bill, which will say, how do we meet the spending targets? And this is a different process than, for example, passing any old regular bill any other time, because normally in the Senate, if you want to pass a bill, you need 60 votes. But reconciliation only needs a simple majority. So this is a really great opportunity for us to get something through. And that something is free community college, which is a part of President Biden's Build Back Better plan. And so, like I said, this process is actually happening right now. Reconciliation is expected to go through the end of October. And we are really close, like I said, to getting free community college. It's being considered, but there's a problem. There are a few senators who are currently not on board with the idea of free community college. Sorry, if we could just go back one slide. Thanks, sorry. So there are those senators here. If you recognize them, if you're from any of these states, if these are your senators, Senators Manchin, Sinema, Tester, Hassan, or Shaheen, these folks are not sold on the idea of free community college. And free community college would obviously be a huge win for us right now, even though it's not the end goal of free college, free public college, 4 years of it. Free community college would be a huge stepping stone in getting towards that goal. Like I said, it would be a huge win. And so we really need to make sure that these senators are on board so we can get this through during reconciliation. And so if these are your senators, I'll let you know in a minute just how you can reach out to them and how you can tell them that they need to get on board with this crucial part of making college affordable and accessible. And on this note, we should also let them know that there should not be eligibility restrictions to free community college or free college in general. Every student, including undocumented students, including incarcerated students, students who have been historically excluded from higher education policy, this should be accessible to them as well. So I'll let you know how we can communicate that message in a minute. But on the next slide, we'll talk about next year. So while reconciliation is happening now, like I said, the next step after getting free community college, we'll be focusing on the long term, what happens next. Our advocacy process in obtaining free college is a multi-step advocacy process. So like I said, we're close to the first step, which is free community college. The goal is 4 years of free public college, and also at HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, at MSIs, minority serving institutions, and tribal colleges. That's the goal. And so just wanted to point out that there is a huge appetite for free college as a concept. There, like I said before, there are a number of free college bills already introduced in Congress. This shows the components of just a few of them. So you can see here, America's College Promise Act, the College for All Act, the Debt Free College Act. They all have varying components and do some measure of free college. So it's exciting to see that this is something that we can achieve. And so thinking more in the long term of what are we going to focus on next year is fighting for some of these, pieces of legislation. So it's a stepping stone. And the next slide. Yep. Thanks. Okay. So for Generation Progress, what are the things that we're looking at? Like I said, free community college for now, 4 years of free college for next year's legislative year. And in addition, we also want to consider the Pell Grant. So if you're not familiar, the Pell Grant is an excellent federal grant, a tool for helping low-income students afford college. And originally, the Pell Grant was able to help students cover more than 75% of the cost of attending a 4-year public college. But unfortunately today, it only covers less than 1/3 of the cost of attending a 4-year school. So we really need the government to reinvest in this grant to double the Pell Grant, what they're funding for it now. And it helps students, like I said, afford the costs beyond just tuition. Students can use the Pell Grant to cover childcare or whatever other costs they have that will make college a reality for them. And it also helps offset the need to take out student loans. So double win there. But yeah, these are just some of the components that we consider when we're talking about free college. And we'll go to the next slide. And here's how you can make this stuff happen. We are hosting a week of action the last week of October to encourage Congress and specifically encourage the Senate to pass free college. And the week of action will include a number of ways you can get involved no matter where you live. You can get involved online. We'll have opportunities for you to post on social media, to email your senators, call your senators. We'll have a number of ways for you to get involved to make free college a reality. And if we all come together, I'm confident that we can make it happen, just like we've made so much progress in terms of debt cancellation. This is just another piece of the puzzle. So if you want to get involved, we'll send you more information. You can go to the link here, tinyurl.com/freecollege2021 to sign up. Like I said, we'll send you more information, but we're really excited to take action to make free college a reality. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Ella, so much. Obviously, this is an issue that's complicated. There's two sides of this coin, and we want to make sure that we're fighting on both ends. Something you brought up is something that I think will segue great into bringing Justin into the conversation. I love, Ella, that you're talking about, what are our goals? What does a win look like? And so I want to bring Justin into the conversation because, Justin, I know, like us, your team is fighting not just to fight, you're fighting to win. So as far as debt cancellation, what does a win look like? And how will that improve and impact the lives of people that are listening and across the country?
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, it's just a privilege to be here. It's a privilege to be on this panel with both Kira and Ella. So thank you for inviting me and including me in this. But yeah, I want to say a win for us, is definitely on the horizon, Cody. And that looks like cancellation of debt for borrowers all across the country, right? That looks like $50,000 of debt cancellation to start with, right? We're not in this for, small change, right? There's some small changes that have been happening and we're grateful for those, right? But we know that in order to have a true impact on this crisis and what's happening in this country with student loan debt, there's got to be at least $50,000 of canceled debt or a student debt canceled by the president through executive authority sooner than later. One of the things that we're seeing is we're still in the middle of this pandemic, right? And so in some ways, we've talked to borrowers, we've talked to people about, just what has this pandemic done to them, right? They're going deeper into debt, they're having more of a financial need. And some of the grace behind this debt, though, has been the pause on student loan debt payments right now. We're talking to borrowers who, finally don't have to make a decision between paying, the light bill and buying groceries. We're talking to borrowers who can afford to go to urgent care or pay for healthcare with that money that they are saving, right? And so that is a testament right there to how much of an impact that student debt has on people. And don't get me wrong, I'm with Next Gen America. We're a youth-led, youth-supporting organization, but this is a multi-generational crisis. It's a multi-generational problem, that affects a number of people. We know that the majority of voters support canceling student debt, right? And that is, if I don't know what the epitome of the will of the people is, that is it right there, so we're definitely on the horizon. And that's something that we're continuing to advocate and fight for every single day. And we know what the impact, we're already seeing signs of what the impact will be if that debt, is canceled. There's been people doing this work for such a long time, like yourself. And we're very thankful for that, and you all have not only just put momentum behind this issue, but you've turned it into a movement. We're seeing coalitions pop up left and right behind this. And we know this is that's one of the most effective ways to gain weight with this, by building coalitions, intergenerational coalitions to get into this fight. Youth-led organizations are getting involved. And although we know this is intergenerational, we know that it's young people that are going to be inheriting this crisis tomorrow. In May of next year, when all these college students start to graduate, they're immediately inheriting this crisis right away. We know that there are still, grandparents that are paying back this debt, parents paying back their debt while their students are in college getting ready to pay back this debt. And young people are trusted, they're trusted messengers when it comes to this issue as well. They're trusted messengers to other young people. Young folks represent now we've like surpassed the boomer generation and the electorate, and we now represent the majority of the eligible voting bloc in the United States, right? And we saw in 2020 when young people went to the polls, when they were casting their votes and their reasons for voting, canceling student debt was at the top of this list. So much that the president put it, in his platform, right? And because of those voices, right? Because it's not just a whisper, but people are coming in with a roar on this. The administration is actually listening. They're addressing this issue. We had the White House press secretary address this issue. Secretary Cardona is listening and addressing this issue, right? And so we don't stop right now. We don't stop right now. Now that we have their ear, we got leaders like elected leaders like Leader Schumer and Congresswoman Pressley and Senator Warren taking on this issue. Like that's a testament in itself right there. And that is a huge statement. And we got to continue that work. We got to continue to write our legislators, write your state legislator. There are state legislatures writing resolutions and sending that to DC, sending that to the White House, right? And that's coalition building. That's coalition building within our communities, coalition building in our state legislatures, inter-organizational, how we're all here today, like building coalitions. And the more coalitions and the stronger we could go with this, the more noise we're going to make, the louder our roar is going to be, to the point where the president can no longer, just not address this situation and go ahead and sign that executive action to cancel student loan debt.
We're with you, Justin. And coalition building is so critical to the work that we do. I've seen this question pop up here in the chat. I just want to remind folks, if you have questions for any of our panelists, you can drop them in the chat. You can also, if you're following us online, use the hashtag SOSD21 and tweet at us. We want to make sure that we're addressing the questions and concerns of everyone watching today. But Justin, with that in mind, and I want to open up this question, I think, to the whole floor, but a couple of people here, they're with us. They agree that student debt cancellation needs to happen. They also agree that the president has the ability to take this action. So the question that keeps coming up is, why hasn't he yet? And I'm wondering if any of you have an opinion as to what is our hang up, and then what do we need to do as advocates and everyday people to push this across the finish line?
I can start off there, and then I'll pass it over to these wonderful people on this panel as well. I think we're in a situation right now where there's a number of crises, happening in the United States. And, I do have, empathy for the president and the situation that he is currently in the administration, managing the pandemic and foreign affairs right now, And I think every day they have to make a decision of what's prioritized, right? Every day they have to look at the constituency, look at, the American people, and just make, actionable and intentional decisions about what to prioritize that day, right? And they're listening. And I think one of the reasons it hasn't happened yet, because even though we've turned this into a movement, and even though we are coming in with a roar, we need to push beyond that. And we need to show the president just how intersectional this is. We need to, there's a racial issue in the United States right now, racial equity, and there's a poverty issue in this country right now. There's a gender equality issue. There's a healthcare. Student debt is a healthcare issue, with people being able to afford healthcare, pay for healthcare. Let's talk about. I know you're having a panel on mental health as well as part of this summit. Like that is serious stuff. That's how this crisis is affecting people. And so if we can show the president that this is not us asking for a handout, but there is a real systemic problem here, and that it is intersectional and it's intergenerational and it affects all kinds of people from all walks of life, I think we could compel the president to go ahead and take action right now. But that takes the people on this panel, that takes the people, in the audience here. It takes us engaging our friends and families and, working with organizations to engage in that process. And like I said, just really expand that effort and that coalition. I saw someone say that, writing letters doesn't work. I'm going to have to disagree on that. Just having conversations with some of these elected officials and them telling me, we're getting swamped with phone calls on this and swamped with letters. And that's the first thing, they brief, their member of Congress or their executive elected official on that day, right? So the more we can pressure them, the more we can inundate them with letters and phone calls, and the more volunteers and people we can get engaged, the louder we can be, and the more we can be, dispel some of those misconceptions that I know, Kira talked about in her presentation. The more we can do that and show truth and facts about this, I think we can have a really good, compelling argument for the president to go ahead and take that pen and sign that executive action.
I think that's 1,000% right, Justin. I think we're in a really unique moment in this country, but I also think that people, we feel a little bit of shame about our student loan debt. It feels a little bit embarrassing to talk about how much debt you have, how it's increased over time. And so I think there's a lot of misconceptions around who holds student loan debt. And you hear that in some of the public commentary. You hear that when folks are focusing on that $1.6 trillion number instead of the 43 million people who would be impacted and what their economic situation is. So I think, the organizations on this call made a huge push to get people's stories together, to have people standing together and talking about what their student loan debt has done in their life. And I think that is so important. And that also, we can't forget that the president hasn't done something like this in the past, right? It's the first time. And anytime you have a first time, it's a little bit scarier. It feels riskier. But President Biden has the authority, and he can do it, and he should do it.
Absolutely agree. I'll just add one more thing. I don't know if this is a concern of President Biden's, but it's a common concern I've heard from other folks when we're talking about why is there no debt cancellation. And I think part of that conversation is that, well, if we just cancel some amount of student debt now, then won't people just continue to rack up the debt in the coming years, and we'll get back to where we were originally with this crisis. We'll just reach this 1.7 trillion number again if we don't take action to address the root cause of the issue. And so I think if we want to make sure that, address that talking point and say, actually, this won't happen again if you do cancel the debt, we've changed the system that got us to this place. And by that, I mean implementing some kind of free college legislation, getting our Congress to pass that. Then they won't have that talking point anymore. They won't be able to say, well, we'll just amass the debt again, because we'll have taken action to make sure that people don't amass the debt again. And I saw someone also say that they're tired of writing letters, but I've seen, in like Justin said, we see the impact that student and borrower advocacy has on elected officials, and even especially if we're talking about moving the needle on free college legislation, on senators. You flooding their email inbox or you calling them and blowing up their phone lines has an impact on their ability to come out and say, actually, I do support XYZ action. And then, down the line, hopefully that means we'll have enough senators to be able to pass a free college bill. And so if you're tired of writing letters, you don't have to write your own. Just sign up at the link that I plugged earlier and just put in your information, and we have a letter already written, and just click. And it's as easy as that. So, yeah.
And Ella, actually hearing you talk about that made me remember one other thing in terms of fixing the system going forward, because I also have heard a lot of people say like, oh, we're just going to be in the situation again. I see some folks in the chat being like, my interest will still continue accruing, et cetera. However, I will say it's a lot easier to change the course of an 8 million person ship versus a 43 million person ship. And if we have broad-based cancellation, we will reduce the volume of people who are in our student loan portfolio. And so I think the first step, of course, is reducing the number of people who are going to be impacted, and then taking those remaining people and implementing additional improvements, fixing IDR, fixing repayment, fixing default, so that this system is more humane and starts to deliver on the promise.
Absolutely.
I don't want to sound like a broken record here, but I got to pause and take my own PSA and double down on everything that you all just said. Y'all, the letters and the calls, they work. I know we hear from folks all the time. They're tired of signing letters. They're tired of signing petitions. But when you work in the spaces that me and Ella and Kira and Justin work, you hear from the lawmakers' offices directly. They get these letters, they hear about them. When the phone calls are ringing, they take notice. So it does work. And I just have to really take this opportunity to remind folks, because we're not asking you to take these actions for no reason. We want to make a difference, and we know this is the best way to do so. There's something that Justin mentioned kind of about, the collision of both the pandemic, the racial reckoning in America and the student debt crisis. And that may be an obstacle currently to get some bold reform pushed across the finish line. But I know that advocates, that hasn't stopped us from chipping away at some of the most important issues. And so, Kira, I wanted to kind of point this question to you, because I know you're an expert in this part of the discussion, but what kind of progress have we made so far, even over the last year, when it comes to providing student debt relief for certain communities, for people that need it most? And why is that not enough and, just a catalyst for pushing harder?
That is a great question. So recently, President Biden has issued new findings for folks who have applied for a borrower defense discharge, which is a form of administrative relief for folks who were defrauded by their college or their university. I see some folks in the chat have been talking about how they were defrauded by their for-profit school. And so they should look at potentially applying for a borrower defense and see if that works for them. President Biden also issued broad-based cancellation for folks with total and permanent disabilities. And all of that relief is fantastic, right? I think it's long overdue, especially the borrower defense debate. If you were watching the news, you saw some of the back and forth with former Secretary DeVos, et cetera. But it's kind of like, if you're dying of thirst, drips of water are good, right? But you really just need someone to turn on the whole spigot. And so here I think we're getting drops of water, but we really need President Biden to turn on the hose and to cancel debt for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, these smaller wins, they're critically important. So we definitely want to, make sure that folks can connect into the relief that they're eligible for. But, we agree, it's not nearly enough. I'm seeing a couple of questions coming through, so I want to give an opportunity to ask you all at the panel some questions that folks have entered in the chat. And I also see we've only got about 10 minutes left here, so I want to get to some great Q&A. I have this great question from Sharon, and I'm going to open it to the floor here. Sharon wanted to know, how does this student debt impact the economy more broadly? So we've talked about how individuals are impacted, but obviously, we're all part of the U.S. economy. What does this mean, and how is it impacting the economy broadly?
I can kick it off. We heard, I believe Senator Schumer mentioned earlier, just some of the life decisions that people are being forced to make now, as student debt is something that more and more people are burdened with. Borrowers like myself need to consider, with this debt, am I going to be able to afford to move? It impacts the kind of job you try to pursue or the career path that you attempt to pursue. And it can impact, instead of 2 jobs, I actually need to have 3 jobs so I can make loan payments. It impacts your ability of your decision to be able to buy a house or get married. So you don't, in case you don't want to potentially burden your partner with that student debt under their name as well. So all of these things contribute to these grander economic decisions that, generations past, I think before student debt became the crisis it is now, past generations might have been able to buy a house without having to consider student debt, and they were stimulating their local economies in that way. But I think now we're seeing less of these bigger purchases, or at least people are having to consider their student debt in making these economy stimulating purchases and decisions, whereas they weren't as much before. So that's one piece of the puzzle. I know there's more to it, but.
I just add real quick. You put $1.6 trillion back into the economy, you're going to see a stimulated economy, right? Just like Ella just said, she talked about the housing market. And if you've seen, I live in Florida, and the housing market right now is ridiculous. It's just not affordable, right? And so it gives people an opportunity to, save for down payment. It gives people an opportunity to not have to graduate college and move back to their parents' house, but actually to have a chance and opportunity to, afford, rent. There's this thing called trickle-down economics, and we can argue whether it works or not, but I can guarantee you that concept and that theory, if you cancel student loan debt, if you bail out the people, you are really going to stimulate the U.S. economy and the economies, abroad.
1,000%. Bail out the people. That's sort of the answer, right? When people are struggling, of course you extend some help. And I think just to add a little bit of color, I think there's the individual economics, but there's also the economics of the community, right? Like the student loan debt crisis is just siphoning money out of communities that have a concentration of student loan borrowers. And that stops them from creating small businesses. And also thinking about how our economy is changing, student loan debt stops people from going back to school and reskilling so that they're ready for this economy. So if we put, like Justin was saying, if we put this money back, it potentially will help address so many problems that so many Americans are facing in this country.
We've talked a few times already about the multi-generational aspect of the student debt crisis. So I want to just kind of explicitly address an issue right here and now, and I see it coming through the chat, but will parents benefit from a debt cancellation proposal? And if so, why is that important to the conversation?
So I think parents is a big group of people. There are the folks that are already parents, that have kids that have student loan debt, that involves people who have little guys who will eventually be thinking about college one day. And so I think when we're thinking about what the impact is for parents, a couple things. So one, if folks have student loan debt, it makes it much harder to be able to afford to care for their aging parents down the line. So that's one thing. And we also know that it's already really hard to care for our aging parents. And it does take money, right? It does take resources to be able to do that. So that's one thing. We also know that as folks are having to repay their student loan debt for longer, that's making it much harder for them to save for their child's education. So it's going to impact whether or not their kids can afford to go to college. So if we have broad-based debt cancellation, it makes it more possible that families will be able to save for their little guys to be able to think about college one day. And then also, I think one of the things that's really important to remember is that a student loan borrower is within their family, and a family often works together to provide some sort of like economic security, right? Like when you're about to get evicted, you might call your family for help. And so if you reduce the debt on one family member, it makes the whole family better off. And so I think that's another thing to remember, even for the parents who may not be Parent Plus borrowers, but may have a student loan borrower in their family. It lifts everybody up when we see a broad-based debt cancellation for everybody.
I'll just add to that, just a personal note here. Like I've met a lot of people that, whose parents have said they can't help with college, and people have done things like join the military to try to get school paid for to avoid student debt. And I can tell you as a veteran, as someone that, joined the military, at the time it wasn't for the GI Bill, but I did utilize my GI Bill. I'm thankful for that. But no person should have to join the military to get an education. And I can tell you right now, about 70% of the people you encounter do that. And just because they do receive a GI Bill, I still know people that are borrowers, veterans that take on the GI Bill and are borrowers and are still stuck, in this crisis as well, because parents couldn't help them, family couldn't help them, and they had to find a way. So they go to a service academy where they have a commitment, or they enlist, or they still have that, commitment to serve in hopes of, avoiding student debt.
One last question here, and I want to just kind of open the floor to get any other voices in here. We've talked about many different communities. Some are more impacted by student debt than others. I just want to open this to all three of you. Are there any other voices that maybe aren't, heard enough in this conversation? And can you take a moment to kind of give them a voice in this moment?
I'll just mention really quickly, just since we were talking, since Justin mentioned a lack of family financial support, I think that reason is one of the biggest reasons why students, whether the family finances aren't there to begin with, or that their parents simply didn't choose to financially support them, that's like one of the biggest reasons why students have to turn to loans. And so because of this, we see also LGBTQ student loan borrowers or students are more likely to need to be able to take out loans to afford higher education compared to non-LGBTQ plus students. So just wanted to mention that. In addition, I think also, we see a lot of struggles faced and obstacles faced by first generation borrowers like myself, who maybe were navigating the process without guidance or without familiarity of the process, and so we're quick to turn to loans without fully understanding the ramifications. So I think those are two categories of borrowers right there. Also just wanted to mention, and then in addition, I mentioned earlier that, you have, for example, undocumented student loan borrowers and incarcerated student loan borrowers are so often historically and still today excluded from the higher education policy making process. So I just wanted to mention those folks, but I know there are other groups as well that I'll let my fellow panelists mention.
You covered a lot of groups there, Ella. But I will also say, the thing that is always frustrating for me is we work at NCLC with a lot of low-income student loan borrowers. And I think what's really hard is that people forget that it's not just student loan debt. Like, people are also struggling for housing. They're trying to afford their transportation to work. They're trying to afford medical expenses. They're trying to afford childcare. And so when you add all of those things up and you think about, all of those areas have substantial problems within them that are causing individual people to have to pay more, you add student loans on top of that and it feels impossible. How do you choose when you're just not able to cover the bills? And so I wish we were hearing from more low-income borrowers. I wish we were hearing from more defaulted borrowers who could tell you how heartbreaking it is to have their wages get garnished when they're already in public housing and they're already working so hard to make sure that they can put food on their table for their kids. And so that is just sort of, I wish that we were thinking more about those people and prioritizing them when we think about the policy changes. It really kills me that we are focused on this teeny tiny population of wealthy people and are afraid of giving them some sort of handout, and that we only think about this in the student loan context. We didn't think about that with the tax breaks. And so I wish we were prioritizing how to capture as many of the people who need debt cancellation as possible, instead of trying to cut out people who are somehow gonna cheat the system.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, Kira. So we're running up against the clock here. So I just want, before we end this panel and move into the next panel, if we could just go in order here, Kira, Ella, Justin, tell us, what can an audience member do to take action to help support the work that you all are doing?
Sure. So I'm going to echo the call. Write those letters, make those calls, send those emails. And on your own student loan debt, you should look at the options that you have for your repayment. So you can go to our website, which is studentloanborrowerassistance.org, to do a little bit more research on what options you have to make your burden a little bit more bearable.
Thanks. I'll just add really quick. Like I said, Generation Progress is hosting a week of action to advocate for free college that last week of October. If you want to get involved, go to tinyurl.com/freecollege2021. Sign up. We'll let you know exactly how you can get involved, how you can pressure your senators to make this a reality. And even before that, if you want to take action today, especially if you're from West Virginia, Arizona, Montana, New Hampshire, call your senators, because your senators are holding up the reality of free community college right now. So call them and go to our link and join us for a week of action.
Absolutely. Definitely echo what, Kara and Ella said. Continue to write those letters, make those calls. There's going to be an intern, a poor intern that's going to, unfortunately have to log every single one of those calls and letters. but they're doing it for a good cause. And volunteer, tell a friend, tell a roommate. We're at nextgenamerica.org, where you can check us out and get engaged, with, all of these groups here. But definitely, it's very relational. You tell a friend, a family member, a roommate. The more you multiply, that force, the bigger roar we're going to have when it comes to student debt. And we can really do some compelling, getting this executive action signed and bringing relief to a lot of people.
Great. Well, thank you all three of you for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation. We'll continue to work together to create change. So again, thank you, Kira Taylor from the National Consumer Law Center, Ella Azaleh from Generation Progress, and Justin Atkins from Next Gen America. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, so thank you all for attending our first panel of the day, the political fight to cancel student debt. Stay on with us. We're very excited for our next panel, addressing racial equity by canceling student debt, where we will talk about how the student debt crisis is a racial justice issue.
It's time to make change. It's time to come to the 21st century and make change, especially for the African American community. It's time to lower these student loan debts or even eliminate these student loan debts for everyone that is struggling, especially during the crisis that we just had in the United States of America and globally.
Student debt is a racial justice and economic justice issue, period. It affects Black people at a disproportionate rate. It has prevented Black folks from equitable access to upward mobility. It has continued to widen the racial wealth gap, and it continues to create barriers for Black people to truly have an equitable start of what it means to build wealth and equity in this country.
Fantastic. So I believe all of our panelists are on now. Can I have our panelists please turn on your mics and your cameras, and we'll go ahead and get started. So I'll pass it on to you now, Whitney.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. My name is Whitney Barclay-Denny, and I am a Senior Policy Counsel with the Center for Responsible Lending. Excuse me, my light is falling apart here. And I'm going to be introducing our panelists. So over a year ago, then candidate Biden presented his plan called Build Back Better in the wake of COVID-19 and the overdue racial reckoning with America's past and present. And included in that plan, then candidate Biden said that he was going to cancel at least $10,000 of student loan debt. He seemed to understand, and his campaign seemed to understand, that student loan debt is a major driver of the wealth gap between Black and white Americans. And he also said that he was going to cancel more for public students, for people who graduated from minority serving institutions, and historically Black colleges and universities, along with others. Unfortunately, President Biden hasn't kept candidate Biden's promises. Despite his campaign's understanding that canceling student loan debt is a key part of any policy advancing racial justice, there has been no mention of broad-based student loan cancellation in the president's recently introduced plan to address the wealth gap. And so far, our pleas to him to use his executive power to cancel debt has fallen on deaf ears. In the next panel, we're going to discuss how student loan debt has specifically disadvantaged Black and brown borrowers and how cancellation would impact those same communities. We're also going to take a deep dive into the student debt crisis for educators and discuss how they've been coping with COVID, debt, and all of the hardships created by 2020. So let's introduce our panel. First up, we have Professor Charlie Eaton. Dr. Eaton is an associate professor of sociology at the University of California, Merced, where he co-founded Higher Education, Race, and Economy Lab, called the HERE Lab. His book, Bankers in the Ivory Tower, The Rise of Financiers in U.S. Higher Education and Society, is currently in production with the University of Chicago Press. Dr. Frederick Weary is the Townsend Martin Class of 1917 Professor of Sociology at Princeton University. He's also the founding director of the Dignity and Debt Network, which is a partnership between the Social Science Research Council and Princeton. And he just launched the Debt Collection Lab, where they are tracking debt collection cases being taken to court in real time, and where they are using arts and different storytelling traditions to change the narrative about debt justice. Finally, we have Dr. Erica Taylor. Dr. Taylor is currently a senior research analyst at the National Education Association, where her duties include collaborating with NEA staff and members to collect and disseminate data that can be used to inform policy and programs. In this role, she has co-led investigations of the professional and financial needs of higher education faculty and staff, and contributed to the NEA's outreach to historically Black colleges and universities. She's also collaborated on research efforts to support NEA's ongoing work around alleviating student loan debt. So let's go to our panel.
So I think I'm starting. I'm Fred Weary, and we're just waiting for the slides to be projected. And there they are. So let me start by talking about why I say cancellation instead of forgiveness. Because it's easy to forget that 6 years after starting college, over 60% of white and Asian students graduate, but only 54% of Latinx students and 38% of Black students graduate in the same time period. Now, those who don't graduate have high debt but no degree. And even with the degree, Black and Latinx college holders are too often underpaid. Those who are burdened by debt but not buoyed by a degree are not the ones who should ask for forgiveness. Those who have been paying on their $20,000 loan for 10 years but now owe $22,600, not having made a dent after a decade, they are not the ones who should be asking for forgiveness. Those who decided to serve the public to become soldiers, teachers, and social workers, in part because they were promised that the investment would be made affordable through a reasonable cancellation policy. They should not be asking for forgiveness. They are not the ones. Instead, those responsible for the student loan program are the ones who should be called to account. President Biden should join Presidents Bush and Clinton and Lyndon B. Johnson and others, not just in affirming the promises made to student borrowers, but President Biden should also keep those promises by apologizing, asking for forgiveness, and making amends. And now to the second slide. And so on this, there we go. Thank you. So we came to these conclusions while asking whether canceling student loans would be a progressive policy, meaning would it provide more benefits to those who have the least economic resources? And we wanted to check the numbers to make sure that what sounded like a good idea would not give more money to people who don't need it. Today, we will highlight some of the findings from our Roosevelt Institute paper. If you read the entire paper, you'll see that we were concerned with correcting a misconception out there that the proposed cancellation of up to $50,000 in student loans would mean that a valuable resource would be wasted on rich people and therefore would not be progressive. We looked at work that others had done in declaring that this would be the case and used the same data they did, but we did a little better with our math, and we measured the things that were indeed present in the data, but ignored by those who wanted to tell a regressive story. We also found that these arguments against student debt cancellation ignored wealth. So if we pretend that Black and brown parents have as much wealth as everybody else, because redlining and occupational discrimination never happened, it might be possible to argue that some people who seem to be doing fine based on their incomes may benefit from debt cancellation. But that would require us to pretend that the racial wealth gap doesn't matter. Because of our findings, we believe that while many student debtors are owed the cancellation of their debts, they are also owed an apology. The only way to come to some other conclusion would require us to make some mistakes in the data analysis and to leave the question of ethics out of the discussion. Next slide, please. Just over half of white students carry student debt, but 3 out of 4 Black students leave school with a federal student loan. And the total population, 17% of white adults, but 27% of Black adults have student loan debt. These disparities reflect and expand existing racial inequities that the student loan program is making worse. Therefore, our government should ask for forgiveness for making racial inequities worse than they already were. And it should acknowledge that the student loan program is harming most borrowers regardless of race, by its design, and by the inattention of its guardians. Next slide, please. And there is even more that needs to be acknowledged and forgiven even while it is being fixed. First, let's think about how these loans are made and how they differ from other loans. When I bought my house, the bank sent someone out to inspect the property to make sure it would be a sound investment. But when students enroll in programs that defraud them, even when those places have a history of being a bad investment, the loans are still made. Second, consider the promise made to those willing to serve their country by joining the military or by becoming social workers or teachers. They were promised that the loans would be canceled so long as they paid on them for 10 years while serving the country. When it came time for the government to make good on that promise, it failed to do so. They blamed students for filling out the wrong paperwork. How millions of people can happen to fill out the wrong paperwork in the same way is not a mistake. It is a design problem. Finally, we need to stop pretending that the past does not matter, that there is an equal playing field for getting ahead if you just do the right thing. We know the histories of injustice that have robbed Black and brown families of wealth, but we ignore that these families have less wealth and therefore have taken on greater debts for college when we look only at the incomes of those who have student loans, but not at the wealth they don't have. In wealth, the legacy of Jim Crow lives on, but in our discussions of debt cancellation, Jim Crow has flown the coop. And for that, there should be an apology. Next slide, please. But how should the apology happen, and why does the how matter so much? Think about this. If somebody stole my car and I lost my job because I couldn't get to work, and the culprit admitted to the wrong, but did not apologize, it would not feel like complete justice. It would also be worse if they promised to pay me for the damages I suffered, but showed up and just threw the money at my feet, leaving me to bend down to gather what I'm owed. Don't get me wrong. I would certainly be relieved to receive what I'm owed, but I would also be outraged in the way that it was delivered to me. It is about the money, but it is also about more than money. Debt cancellation is not a handout. It is a move toward justice and should be talked about in that way. And it should be a move that happens automatically, not asking that the borrower chase a new set of forms or that they bend down to gather what is scattered across the floor. Next slide, please. In the next few minutes, we are going to show you why analyzing only the incomes of debtors, but not their wealth, has helped to erase the problem of racial injustice in our country. And we will argue that a win for racial justice is a win for everyone. Next slide, please. We will also show you why a lower debt cancellation of only $10,000 will fail to address the needs of Black borrowers in particular. We'll do this so that we can avoid the mistake of having a policy that on its face shows that people are doing better, but in reality, a sizable group of people may be feeling a little worse. Next slide, please. For now, let me just remind you of the promise made again and again. And I look here to President Clinton talking about a new covenant with America. He envisioned, quote, an America in which the doors of college are thrown open once again to the sons and daughters of stenographers and steel workers. We will say, everybody can borrow money to go to college, but you must do your part. You must pay it back from your paychecks, or better yet, by giving back, going back home and serving your communities. Now, students have done their part, but our government has not. Next slide, please. And on to my colleague, Charlie.
Thanks, Fred. So following that promise, I trace before and after that promise in my book, Bankers in the Ivory Tower, what happened to student debt before and after that promise. That book's going to be out in February, so keep your eyes peeled for it. This graph is from the book. And what we can see here is the line with crosses. There's two lines there, but the line with crosses plots total federal student loan borrowing per year since 1972 with an adjustment for inflation. And the y-axis on the left side of the graph is for the total borrowing in billions. What this plot shows is that federal student loan borrowing was actually flat at around $20 billion per year during the 1980s. The red arrow shows when Clinton made the promise you just heard about student loans. The following year, he signed the Student Loan Reform Act, and he began implementing the Income Contingent Loan Program. It's after this promise and policy changes that student loan borrowing increases nearly sixfold to a peak of almost $120 billion per year in 2011. This increased borrowing was not just from more students going to college. The graph's line with circles shows that borrowing per student more than tripled from around $2,000 per year in the 1980s to more than $6,000 per year since 2009. That level of average borrowing adds up to tens of thousands of dollars in debt per student if they take several years to earn a bachelor's degree or a graduate degree. Can we go to the next slide? But President Clinton wasn't the only one making unkept promises. This is a quote from George W. Bush at the ceremony in 2007, where he signed the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program into law. Bush says the law would help millions of low-income Americans earn a college degree. But Bush goes farther in saying the plan would provide government help for, quote, men and women in uniform in dealing with your loans. Can we go to the next slide? Here, though, is the same graph from my book that we just saw. But this time, the red arrow shows when Bush signed the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program into law. As we can see, annual student loan borrowing continued to grow afterwards, though it has leveled off since 2012. Through income contingent loans and public service loan forgiveness, student debts were supposed to be canceled if students performed public service or couldn't afford to repay their debts. But we now know that only 32 students have ever had their debts canceled from the income contingent loan program that Clinton began. Next slide. The Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program is not projected to do much better than income contingent loans. A recent analysis by the Student Borrower Protection Center found that only 1 in 5 applicants is projected to receive cancellation. These broken promises compound longstanding economic injustices afflicting African Americans and other low-wealth Americans. Next slide. Consider that Black Americans work in public service at a higher rate than whites, but Black Americans have not received student debt relief for their service. Next slide. Instead, the median Black borrower still owes 113% of their original debt 12 years after school because of compound interest. It is still too much for anyone to owe 12 years later, but the median white borrower owes just 65% of their original debt 12 years later. Next slide. Without promised debt cancellation, Black students have particularly struggled with student debt because of the racial wealth gap. The racial wealth gap widened in prior generations as racism blocked Black parents from accumulating wealth. As a result, those Black parents lack wealth to help their children make college and loan payments. Next slide. We document this relationship between student debt and the racial wealth gap in our recent Roosevelt Institute paper. This is a graph from the paper. It shows that low wealth people have the most debt by far that would be canceled. Like canceled debts spiraling down a drain, each spiral bar in the graph plots the average debt per person that would be canceled for a given racial group and wealth bracket under the Warren-Schumer plan. The pink bar at the top, the small pink bar, shows that people in the top 10% for wealth from all racial groups would receive just $562 in debt cancellation on average, almost nothing. The next gray and light brown bars show that people in the top 30% for wealth would also have little debt to be canceled. But the yellow, beige, and red bars show that Latinx, white, and Black people in the bottom 10% for wealth would all receive above $11,000 in debt cancellation on average. The red bar shows that Black people in the bottom 10% would receive the most cancellation at an average of $17,000, $366. This average cancellation for Black people in the bottom 10% is more than 30 times the average cancellation for people in the top 10%. We had to use the spiral bar graph developed by W.E.B. Du Bois because the bar plotting this Black average for debt cancellation would run off the page of a traditional bar graph. Next slide. Our research also shows that income restrictions for debt cancellation would exclude many Black and other low wealth borrowers. This is because even borrowers with higher incomes after college can come from low wealth backgrounds. In fact, that's how college is supposed to work. Next slide. We illustrate this in another graph from our paper. Black Americans tend to have higher debts than whites with equivalent incomes because Black students tend to inherit less wealth. In this graph, the lines plot average debt per person that would be canceled by race and income bracket under the Warren-Schumer plan. This shows that even lower middle income Black people would tend to receive more than twice the debt cancellation of higher income whites who tend to have more family wealth. Next slide. Oh, looks like we might have dropped a couple of our slides off here, or we jumped ahead. Back one more. So forward one, there you go. There you go. So these debts in turn prevent even higher income borrowers from building wealth and securing their place in the middle class. This is especially true for Black Americans. And that leads to an incredible result. You want to jump to the next slide? So while student debt has blocked equitable wealth accumulation, millennials have fallen far behind prior generations when it comes to saving, buying homes, or building other types of wealth. This is the remarkable statistic that shows that baby boomers in 1989 had 7 times the average net worth as what millennials held at the same age in 2019. And our next and last slide. So what are the implications of all this? We see 3 takeaways. Fred told you some of them, but to repeat them. First, debt cancellation must come with an apology that acknowledges the broken promises of federal student loan policies over the last 30 years. Second, debt cancellation must be automatic. Otherwise, eligible public servants and other low wealth borrowers, including many African Americans, will continue to fall through the cracks of debt relief programs. Third and last, debt cancellation must be as broad as possible. If it isn't, Black and other low wealth borrowers with higher incomes will continue to be excluded from building wealth and securing their place in the middle class. And on that note, thank you again to all of you with Student Debt Crisis and all of you who joined us today for including us in this conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I appreciate having this opportunity to present on behalf of my colleagues at the NEA. We've been looking at some of these issues for a couple of years now. And what I'm sharing with you today are the results of a survey that we conducted late last year. And then also we developed a report based on that survey. So I'm just going to show you a small piece of that because we don't have time to go through all of our findings. But I wanted to also start with just a bit of my debt story. I was fortunate enough to pay off my student loan debt at this point, but I have plenty of friends who now have children in college, as many of you have put in the chat, who are still paying off their loans. So they're not able to help their children get through school because as much as they would if they didn't have those debts. So it's very difficult to imagine that that couldn't possibly have some sort of impact on intergenerational wealth. It absolutely has to. So unless we do something about this now, unless we alleviate these issues now, this is going to continue to snowball from generation to generation. Next slide, please. So just to give you a flavor for what we actually did, we conducted this survey from October 30th to December 14th of 2020. I don't know why I was about to say 19. The respondents totaled 2,498, which is of course just under 2,500. And we drew from a sample that included NEA members, but then we also used 2 marketing panels just to increase the number of educators that we were able to reach. One of the reasons why we thought this was important to do, this survey was important to do, was because we wanted to understand how student loan debt had an impact on educators. We hear about student loan debt writ large in the population, particularly those among those who have engaged in public service careers, but we wanted to know specifically for educators what they're experiencing in terms of student loan debt. So all of the pre-K-12 student respondents worked in public schools, while the higher education respondents worked in both public and private institutions. And we weighted the data appropriately based on the demographics of the national educator population. Next slide, please. So we're now going to get into the current situation, which you've heard already. Next slide, please. This is the premise on which we crafted our survey and wanted to know more about educators, which is the continually increasing load of student loan debt, which you've already discussed in other panels, and how the increase between $500 billion in 2007 to $1.6 trillion as of this year is something that is having an impact nationwide, of course. In our report, we talk about some of the systemic reasons as to why this has happened, including federal disinvestment in higher education, pay inequities, and systemic racism that make this issue much more complex than just a group of misguided people making poor financial decisions, which is, I think, a pretty prevalent narrative about who is actually borrowing, who has borrowed, and who actually owes this money. And we demonstrate very clearly that there are policies and structures in place that have been designed to get exactly the results that we see in this graphic. Next slide, please. So we found that among the educators who responded to our survey, that 45% took out a loan to pay for their own education. And on average, the amount that they took out was about almost $56,000, about $55,800. In addition to that, we found that nearly a third, 30%, took out $65,000 or more, and 11% of those whom we surveyed took out $105,000 or more to fund their education. Next slide, please. So we then asked, okay, of those of you who borrowed, how many of you still have a loan balance? And we found that more than half of our educators who responded to our survey, 53%, said that they still have a loan balance, which out of all educators that we surveyed, that means that approximately 1/4 of them currently still have student loan debt. In addition to that, we found that the average remaining balance for those educators was almost $59,000. 32% owed $65,000 or more, and 14% owed $105,000 or more. Now you'll notice that on the previous slide, we told you that the debt was about $56,000, and now we're saying 59. Well, as many as you know, there are a couple of reasons for that. The first reason is that those with lower balances have likely paid either more of theirs or they paid it off. So we're left with the people who have these exorbitant loan amounts that they've had to take out. The other reason is that interest has accrued over time. So from when they took out the loan until when we asked them about their balance, they likely accrued interest that could have taken them over their original borrowing amount to begin with. So those are things that we've noticed in our survey. Those are things that we've been told, and it's alarming to see that you take out this kind of money, and then of course on top of that, you're then saddled with interest that you have to pay back as well. Next slide, please. So there's a lot on this graph, but one of the reasons why I wanted to include it is that I just really wanted to point out that those educators who are in higher education, particularly those higher education faculty, are more likely than other educator groups to have high current loan balances. As you can see in the dark blue bars on the far right, 48% of our higher ed faculty say that, I'm sorry, the headings are missing. The heading is that they owe more than $65,000. So the more education, of course, you get, the more money you end up owing on the back end. Next slide, please. So while we found that there are, of course, student loan issues that are unique to our early career educators, there are student loan debt issues that are unique to our, we call them more experienced and retired educators, as people have been putting in the chat. We today are focusing on student loan debt among educators of color. Next slide, please. So before we examine what our educators of color told us about our student loan debt, we have to establish the context in which they were borrowing, because it doesn't occur in a vacuum. And as my colleagues have already stated, there are historical and current institutionally racist practices that continue to create barriers to attaining higher education. And ultimately, this likely has an impact on the accumulation of intergenerational wealth. So this becomes a cyclical issue. So for Black families in particular, and I will, as my colleagues have pointed out, there's a reason as to why we also focus on Black families in particular. The discrimination that we're seeing is related to, it ultimately impacts the amount of contributions that parents are able to make to their children's education. And that rate then leads to higher borrowing rates among Black students because of the contributions that their families are not able to make. That is related to intergenerational wealth and the inability to accumulate the same amount of intergenerational wealth as other groups. So this discriminatory practices that we see aren't just unique to Black families, aren't just unique to the things that Black families have uniquely experienced in this country. We also find that currently students who are attending HBCUs and minority serving institutions and community colleges, regardless of race, are often charged more for the same loan amount than students who are attending predominantly white and four-year institutions. So the type of school you attend then might cost you more money on the back end because you're being charged more for having attended those institutions. We also found that the average base salary for Black pre-K through 12 teachers is lower than every other racial group except race or ethnic group, except for Native American and Alaskan Native teachers. And that's from the US Department of Education, their most recent data on teacher salaries. So Black teachers, in addition to being paid less for the same work, are also more likely to be unemployed than white teachers, twice as likely, in fact. And while the unemployment rate among teachers is very low, because we recognize that in some areas there are shortages, of those who are unemployed, Black teachers are twice as likely to be unemployed. Next slide, please. So one of the other reasons that we focus on Black families and the experiences of intergenerational wealth here and the experiences of institutional racism is because we've seen in our data, as others have pointed out, our educators told us, our Black educators were more likely to have taken out loans than other ethnic groups. So more than half of our Black educators reported having to take out a loan for their education, as compared to just under half of white students and white educators, and also just under half for Latino educators. Actually, the 47% should be Latino educators, and the white educators are the 44%. Next slide, please. In addition to being more likely to take out loans, Black educators are more likely to take out larger amounts. So as you'll see on the far right, which is again the $65,000 or more, we see that almost half, 47% of Black educators have taken out loans to fund their educations, as compared to just over 1/4 of white educators, and also about 29% of our Latino, Hispanic, and Chicano educators. Next slide, please. So also Black educators who took out loans were more likely to have not fully paid off their debt. Nearly 3/4 of Black educators whom we surveyed who reported having loan debt still have a balance, as compared to nearly 2/3 of the Latino, Hispanic, and Chicano educators, and nearly half of white educators. So we're seeing borrowing patterns here and loan balance patterns that are consistent with what the research has already shown us. Next slide, please. So in addition to having being more likely to have a loan balance and being more likely to borrow, Black educators that we surveyed also had larger unpaid balances on average than the white and the Latino, Chicano, Hispanic educators whom we surveyed. So about $72,000 is what our Black educators told us that they're owing, as compared to white educators who owe approximately $58,000, and our Latino educators who owe, we'll say $51,000 for the sake of being efficient. Let's be clear, all of this is a lot of money. And also let's be clear that all of this is more than $50,000. So we do have some issues here that need to be addressed, but it's disproportionate in terms of race and ethnicity, as it is clear in this graph. Next slide, please. So educators of color with unpaid loans are also more likely than white educators to have made a late payment, missed a late payment, or have gone into default. So more than half of educators of color indicated that they had made a late payment, as compared to 37% of white educators. In addition, just less than half have missed a payment among educators of color, where fewer than 1/3 of white educators missed a payment. And in terms of default, approximately 1/4 of those whom we surveyed reported that they had gone into loan default, as compared to 15% of white educators. Next slide, please. So we also wanted to not just lift up the disproportionate student loan debt situations that we found in our data. We also wanted to lift up what our educators told us about how the student loan debt in general is having an impact on their financial lives. And what I'm going to report is for all of those who reported to us that they still hold a loan debt balance. But we just wanted to make sure that we sort of made this real. We really wanted to know what is the overall impact of the student loan debt on the decision-making that people are making financially, et cetera. Next slide, please. Now, I know that the previous panel sort of went over some of these things, but I want to highlight it for educators. So the red bars are those who have not paid their loans. The gray bars are those who have paid their loans. The first two sets of bars are those who are trying to build an emergency savings. So more than half of our educators who have not yet paid a loan indicated that it has an impact on their ability to build a savings and to build wealth, as compared to 39% of those who had already paid their loans. So the second two halves of bars are for physical and mental well-being. And the red bar, once again, is those who have not yet paid their loans. 40% of those who have not yet paid their loans are saying that they don't have the resources to go to take care of themselves, to take care of their own well-being, whether it's physical or mental, as compared to 17% of those who have not yet paid loans. And I apologize, the formatting got a little messed up here. So I'm trying my best to explain where we are. Next slide, please, and thank you. Okay, so this slide indicates that those who with unpaid loans were more likely to experience specific financial difficulties during the pandemic. And so for this slide, paying credit card balances was supposed to be the first bar. In the first bar, 35% of our educators who said that they were having difficulty paying credit card balances during the pandemic rather, while only 31% said that before the pandemic they were having issues. So the point here on this slide is that during the pandemic, financial problems for those who had not paid their loans off yet became worse during the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, it was bad, but during the pandemic, it just became worse. Next slide, please. So in terms of financial issues before and during the pandemic, this slide in sum basically tells you that those who paid off their loans look a heck of a lot like those who never had loans at all. But those who have not yet paid off their loans are having significant issues both before and after the pandemic, as I mentioned previously. So we're just digging in a little bit deeper into what those educators who have not yet paid their loans look like and are experiencing versus those who have paid off their loans or who never had to take out loans at all. And clearly they look very different financially. For example, in terms of buying food, which is the first bar on the left, those with unpaid loans, 16% reported prior to the pandemic that they were having difficulty buying food. Buying food as an educator. I'll just let that sit for a second. As compared to 8% of those who had no loans and 6% of those who had not yet paid their loans. 6% of those who had already paid their loans. So essentially, those who never had loans and those who had already paid loans, as I said before, look very similar. During the pandemic, 20%, so 1 in 5 of our educators reported having a difficulty buying food, as compared to 11% of those who had no loans or had not paid loans at all. Now, I also want to emphasize that the fact that our educators are reporting having difficulty purchasing food at all is a bit disturbing. It's even more disturbing for those who have not yet paid their loans. Also, in terms of making rent or mortgage payments, 22% prior to the pandemic reported that they had difficulty if they had not yet paid their loans, and that increased to 29% during the pandemic. Once again, those who never had loans or those who had already paid their loans look pretty much the same at about 10%, and then again at about 12 or 13%. And we see a similar pattern for the other two, for paying medical expenses and then also paying for utility bills, where the situation prior to the pandemic was bad, but it gets systematically worse as we go through the pandemic. Next slide, please. Okay, so those educators with unpaid loans whom we surveyed reported that they were more likely than those who had paid loans or no loans to report skipping medical necessities during the pandemic due to their financial priorities. So the first group of bars, the first group of red, pink, and gray bars, those are referring to routine medical appointments. So 40% of our educators reported, who had not paid off their loans, reported that they were foregoing medical appointments in order to pay other bills and had other financial priorities. The second set of 3 bars is for acute medical appointments. So more than 1/4 of our educators who had not paid off their loans yet have indicated that they are not going to acute medical appointments, as compared to 15 and 13% of those who had already paid their loans or who never had loans at all. And then again, for approximately 1/4 of our educators, the last 3 set of bars, that's filling a prescription. So about 1/4 of our educators who have unpaid loans are not filling prescriptions, as compared to 16% of those who had already paid loans and 12% who never had any loans at all. Next slide, please. Okay, so briefly, just wanted to talk about what these implications are for education in general. Sorry, my earpiece keeps coming out, and that never happens. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we are already noticing in the educator population is that people who are entering schools of education is on the decline. So people don't want to be teachers anymore. And what we are also seeing, what previous research has also shown us, is that the student loan debt issue among educators, particularly student loan debt problem, particularly for those who aspire to be educators, I should say, is particularly dire. So that student loan debt burdens after becoming an educator are deterring future teachers from actually pursuing the career. And it's particularly acute for those for students of color. So people see what other people are going through in terms of paying their debt. They see what other people are experiencing in terms of pay and struggling financially, and they don't want to experience that. And I believe that was mentioned in the previous panel as well, that people are making career choices based on the student loan debt burden that they will have to endure after they finish their education. And this is clearly having an impact on the educator pipeline as well. And we're seeing that we lack diversity in the educator pipeline as it is. So these disproportionate impacts of student loan debt that we're seeing, that are in turn deterring people of color, people in general, but also people of color from entering the pipeline, will continue to perpetuate the lack of diversity that we see among our educator population. Next slide, please. So this is great, but what do we do? The first thing that we are advocating for, as everyone else is broad-based federal student debt cancellation for borrowers, regardless of the type of loan they took or when they took it. So if you owe, you should just be forgiven. We're also advocating for cancellation of student debt for educators and public service workers who've already paid, who have served a decade or more and have repaid for more than a decade, so that they have actually done what they were supposed to do according to the rules of the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, but still haven't been honored with the promise that it actually made. So, and in addition to that, we are also advocating for fixing PSLF, of course. But in terms of immediate issues, we certainly advocate for broad-based student cancellation. In addition to that, we also have, and I will share this link in the chat, but we are also recommending, and I know that some folks said in the chat that they don't believe that letter writing is effective, but we in fact do. So we are recommending that people will write Secretary of Education Miguel Cardona, and that is because the U.S. Department of Education issued a request for information regarding the overall impact that student loan debt has had on individuals. And the deadline is approaching quickly, but there still is time to write a letter, and we have a link where they will have a letter that's already formatted for you. You just fill in your information, and you can even personalize it beyond that if you'd like. And you can tell Secretary Cardona directly what has happened in your life as a result of this student loan debt, the student loan debt that you have. So we strongly recommend that you do that as well. There should be one more slide. I'm not sure if it's there or not. Might not be. Nope. Okay, well, I will also make sure that you have my information. I am actually the corresponding author on the report that I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. So if you have any questions regarding the report itself or this presentation, please feel free to reach out to me. Thanks very much for your time and attention.
Great. Thank you so much to these amazing panelists. We only have time for a question or two, and I have pulled some out of the chat, but I just also wanted to address really quickly, we saw a lot of folks talking in the chat about why we're specifically discussing Black student loan debt and not everyone's student loan debt. And here's the deal, guys. Black borrowers take out more money, they take longer to pay it off, and they're more likely to default because of generational wealth differences that we call the racial wealth gap. And those wealth differences are caused by racism in our policies and in our banking and in our institutions. And so it's really important that we understand that while everybody is in a raft that is sinking with student loan debt, Black borrowers are sinking faster. They have more holes, they have fewer buckets to bail themselves out, and fewer things to try to get out of that raft. And so that's why we have to discuss this issue as an issue of race, because that's frankly what the facts show us and what the data shows us, is that there is a specific Black student loan crisis. So I just wanted to address that before we went any further into this discussion. So a couple of questions that we have here. Can the panelists address, we talked a little bit in the first presentation about the difference between income and wealth. Can the panelists expand on that a little bit more? What is the difference between income and wealth? And I will throw that to anybody who wants to take it.
I think Charlie has since he had a great slide on this. Charlie, do you want to expand on that, on what we saw in that slide?
Yeah, sure. So income is what we get paid. For most people, income is what we get paid for the work we do. For the very, very rich, it tends to be income that you get paid from profits of things you own. And that's where wealth comes in. Wealth is possessions that we own. It's the house that we own. It's the car that we own. For the very rich, it's the corporations or the stocks that you own. And for most people in America, wealth, the biggest source of wealth is the homes that they own. And that is a big part of the racial wealth gap, a primary area where Black Americans were blocked from building household wealth is in housing because of discrimination and racist mortgage policies and neighborhood redlining. Many Black Americans could not acquire homes in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and accumulate wealth around those homes. And, one thing I would add to what Whitney said about why it's really important to note the racial wealth gap and racial inequalities in student debt is that it's Black Americans who are most afflicted by a lack of household wealth because of discrimination, but they're not the only Americans afflicted by a lack of household wealth. And so that's why we noted it's not just Black Americans with low household wealth, but many other Americans, including Latinx Americans. We saw that Latinx borrowers tend to have more debt after 12 years. And we also see that there's many low wealth white borrowers as well, but the rates of low household wealth are far higher for Black Americans because of historical discrimination.
Thank you for that. And that actually leads perfectly into my next question, and I think will probably be our final question. One of the things that I would say drives some of this as well is after the 2008 crisis, right? We saw an extreme decrease in the Black wealth that had been built as Black families were disproportionately affected by the foreclosure crisis and recovered more slowly. So are there other historical moments, and I will throw this to anyone who wants to take it, that have put us on this track for the student debt crisis? Or how many other historical moments can we count in 3 minutes that we have left?
Yeah, so I'll just plug Charlie's book. So one of the things that Charlie does is he indicates the moments in which we change the way we're financing college. And so if you think about sort of how we finance college and how much the financing costs and where those costs are passed to, that's when you start to sort of see some big changes. I think Charlie should plug his own book because it's coming out soon and it's doing the things that need to be done. But Charlie, do you have anything else to add on that?
Yeah. So the book Bankers in the Ivory Tower, it'll be out in February. Hopefully you'll be, if you follow, I just put links in the chat where you can follow Fred and me on Twitter. And I'll announce when you can pre-order the book on Amazon and elsewhere. But the 1980s is a really big, important era because that's really the era where the federal government and state governments stop paying for Pell Grant aid adequately, and they stop paying for low and free tuition at public universities. And so that's why at the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s, policymakers make this choice that we're going to, instead of paying for college that way, we're going to expand student debt. And as we've seen, that's been disastrous for low wealth households, even folks who go on to make more money after college. If you don't have household wealth accumulated, it's just a bottomless pit to be paying off those debts.
And then I'll just add that the one thing we have to remember is that when the racial inequities are addressed, everybody wins. And so the only way you can lift up Black and Latinx households is to create policies where other low wealth households are also benefiting. And by raising up the issue of Black and Latinx households, you're able to kind of bring in the sort of, the next time they do a Juneteenth celebration, I'm going to say thank you for the holiday. Now, if you've not done it yet, can you actually do something to affirm that you believe in and what you say you believe in, right? And so there are more opportunities that are ritualized in which we can draw attention to sort of the wealth stripping, the consequences of the wealth stripping, and how addressing that kind of targeted wealth stripping helps all of us.
Great. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Whitney. Thanks, Erica. Really great to join you all.
Likewise.
Great. Well, thanks again so much to our amazing panel for this incredible conversation. We appreciate your voice. We appreciate your research. And thank you again for being with us today. To our attendees, thank you as well for joining us today. We are going to move forward to our student help clinic next. So if you have any questions, we are monitoring the chat, seeing all of your really great questions. Feel free to jot some more down. And in a few minutes, we're going to have our student help clinic. Some ideas or some topics might include repayment plans, looking at different forgiveness options, and also what will happen in February 2022 when our COVID-19 update is ending. So please feel free to start thinking of some questions, and we will be back with you very soon. For our borrowers and panel and other parents and students, this is a great opportunity to really think about how you can best prepare yourself for the payment when the payment pause ends. So take some time, think of some questions, and it looks like our panelists are here. So if panelists, if you could turn on your camera and your audio, we'll get started now. Thank you.
Hey, Ryan, thank you for that. And thank you everyone for coming to the Student Loan Help Clinic. I hope you're all doing well and ready to learn a little bit more about, our student loans. I think it's really important for us as borrowers. I'm a borrower myself. Most of the people on our panel today are also borrowers, for us to know a little bit about how we can get ourselves into a good, better situation, how we can pay off our loans, or what can help us lower our monthly payments, or just knowing the COVID-19 updates is super important. My name is Sabrina. I'm the outreach coordinator at Student Debt Crisis, and I'm a student loan borrower. I'm a first-gen college student, so for me, navigating all of that was a challenge. I don't know how it was for all of you. If you can write in the chat, if you were first-gen or how you navigated, who taught you about student loans. So we'd love to hear from you. We have a lot to dive in and see, so let's jump right in. So yeah, we're Student Debt Crisis Center, and we're hosting this help clinic, and we're also joined by Savvy, which is a free repayment tool that we'll talk about a little bit moving forward. If you can go to the next slide. So for today's clinic, we'll be discussing student loan basics, policy updates, repayment plans, and loan forgiveness. And at the end, we'll also share that online tool that I just mentioned to help you understand your options a bit and to enroll in programs. And I just want to make it clear that we are not financial counselors or attorneys, but that we are here to help you. Next slide. So I'll be joined with Natalia, who will be presenting for SDCC, and then Lindsay Clark and Ian Kuhn will be presenting for Savvy today. So our theory of change, by centering the needs and voices of borrowers and partnering with allies, we will impact public policy and end the student debt crisis. So for us, we think it's really important for us to address borrowers' needs and to fix the failed policy. We know that now borrowers are the ones who are dealing with student debt, having to pay for their higher education because states aren't paying for it. And so it's fallen onto the shoulders of borrowers. And so we know that that needs to change, and we need to address that immediately. And we see that over 45 million Americans are being impacted with over $1.7 trillion. And that's just out of control. It's a crisis. And so if you look at the national spotlight, the average student has $37,172. And that's not to scare anyone on this call, but it's just to let you know that you're not alone in this. I have about $43,000 in student loan debt. I have heard from so many borrowers who have less, who have a lot more. But this is a systemic problem. This isn't our mistake. We sought higher education so that we can, seek a better future, so that we could pursue our dreams and go on to doing the things that we really wanted to, but the system failed us, and now we're left with this debt, and we're going to look and see how we can deal with it moving forward. And so as we talk about impacted communities, this is so important because it's who is really being affected the most, and we really need to highlight voices and bring our awareness to these communities. So we often talk about women holding 2/3 of the total student debt in the United States. And we know that women already suffer from gender equity issues within the country. We know that Black women have the most debt per borrower, and we know that communities of color are heavily impacted. When it comes to older borrowers, I've been seeing it a lot in the chat, borrowers who have talked about how they've been paying for years. We hear stories of people who are in their 80s and 70s, who are still paying off their student loan debt. And this is immoral. This is something that needs to be addressed. This is wrong. And over 70% of recent grads have debt. So whether you have been paying for 20 years, or you're looking to go to college, or you're a recent grad, or you're a parent or a guardian, this is a clinic or a workshop that will really teach you how to learn more about your student loans, and it's really important. Next slide. And all of this creates a sort of domino effect. We know that it has a negative impact on wealth. On both of the previous panels, we talked about income versus wealth, and we know that it says here an average 30-year-old borrower has $8,000 less in wealth because of student debt. We know that it prevents home ownership. More than half of first-time home buyers cite student debt as a barrier, and we hear that so many times. I'm not able to get a home loan or a car loan because I have student loan debt, and it's just holding me back. I can't get married. I can't, have childcare. I can't go to work and have someone take care of my child. So it puts people in a really tough position, and it's just this endless cycle. And then looking at financial thin ice, Black and Latinx people are more prone to unemployment, especially during times of crisis. And we saw this during COVID. It was amplified how people of color, especially women of color, lost their jobs at such higher rates. And that impacts people's abilities to being able to pay their student loans. So it just, again, creates this perpetual cycle, and it's something that needs to be addressed. And that's why we advocate so much for student debt cancellation. Next slide. And so today's agenda will be covering how you can understand your loans, important updates, repaying your loans, federal loan forgiveness, and how to use the Savvy tool. So with understanding your loans, we'll talk about student loan basics, a little bit about loan servicers, and where you can find more information. Next slide. One of the questions that we get asked the most is, do I have federal loans or do I have private loans? And sometimes, borrowers, we don't know. So if you want to know if you have federal loans, you can find details at studentaid.gov. Federal loans often have fixed interest rates. They have different repayment plans. If you're facing hardship, there are deferment options. There are often loan forgiveness programs such as PSLF, Public Service Loan Forgiveness, and there will be default rehabilitation options. When it comes to private loans, details are usually found on credit report, or you can contact your lender, and there are variable interest rates, and there's no guaranteed repayment plans or hardship deferment or default rehabilitation. So it's often more challenging, especially during times of crisis, for you to pay back your private loans. I know that during COVID, I have a mixture of federal and private loans, and paying off my private loans during this time was so challenging because I already was out of work, and then I had to rely on my parents to help me out, and there's no deferment option or no forbearance. And so I've often heard from borrowers also saying, I have private loans and there's no relief. So unfortunately, we've been hearing that kind of thing, and private loans are very challenging. Next slide. And so there are different types of federal loans. There are direct loans, and then older loans are Perkins loans and federal family education loans, or FFEL loans. So the Perkins loan, I have a Perkins loan. I don't believe that they still have Perkins loans. These are older ones. So direct loans are most typically the loans that you'll find today. Next slide. And so when we're talking about federal servicers and private servicers, if you're looking at these images here, if you have federal loans, there's a chance that one of these servicers are your one of these federal services are your loan servicer. I have Nelnet. And then for private servicers, there's Navient, Sallie Mae, Wells Fargo, SoFi, and Discover. So Navient, even if you tell us, oh, I have Navient, it could be a chance that the Navient loan that you have is a private loan. And so I also have Discover. And if you compare the interest rates between the two, it's crazy to even think about. I mean, I have Discover and I have like 12% interest, which is crazy, out of this world, compared to the federal loan. So next slide. And so if you're looking to find your federal loans, if you're wondering where can I find more information about them, you can look on studentaid.gov to access the federal loan database. You can also speak with your loan servicer company who can provide you more information. And you can also find information in the federal database. And then if you're looking for private loans, maybe you're not sure if you have it, if you don't find information at studentaid.gov, maybe if there's no information there, it could be that you have it. If you have a cosigner, it could be that that means you have a private loan. If you check your credit report, you can also see that. And then you can also contact a lender, servicer, or debt collector to find out more about your private loans. And then in this next section, we'll talk about important updates. We'll talk about COVID-19 relief, policy updates, and additional information. And so many of you might have heard that the payment pause for federal loans have been extended until January 31st, 2022. So payments are scheduled to begin again February 1st. But for now, payments are suspended and interest has been waived. Suspension counts towards PSLF and default rehabilitation. So if you're enrolled in the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, and even though your loans are paused, each month that goes by, it's still counting towards that 120 payments that you're supposed to be making monthly. So you're getting some relief in that sense. And borrowers can recertify their income for an IDR, an income-driven repayment plan, if their income changes during this time. So if you have hours that have been cut short, if you have lost a job, you can recertify with your new income levels. Next slide, please. And so for borrowers in default, tax and Social Security withholdings for federally held student loans in default are suspended. So what happens is if you are defaulted on your student loans and the government was taking, your payments out of your wages or from your taxes or Social Security, they are no longer doing that for now. It has been suspended. And for borrowers in default, employers are instructed to halt wage garnishments, and borrowers did have their wage garnishments. You're entitled to a refund if your wages were garnished during this time. And collection activities like calls and letters have also been paused to defaulted borrowers. And so who receives COVID-19 relief? Federal direct loans and other federally held loans are eligible for the pause in payments and the pause in interest as well. Until recently, unfortunately, commercially held FEL and Perkins loans were excluded from all relief. For now, FEL loans have interest and debt collection paused, and unfortunately, private loans are not eligible. And if we look at the timeline, we see that in March 2020, Congress passed the CARES Act, which is when the first pause was enacted. And then the preliminary COVID-19 relief end date was scheduled for January 31st, 2021. And then it was extended by President Biden until September 30th, 2021. And because of your voices and because of your stories and because of, all of you standing behind us, signing petitions, sending letters, we were able to get the pause extended until January 31st. And so that's why it's so important for you to share your story, for you to speak up, for you to take action, because it really does matter. And we're going to keep pushing for the payment pause to be extended until there's debt cancellation. And so February 1st, the payments are set to resume, but we're going to continue fighting for debt cancellation and for the payment pause to be extended until the debt is canceled. And recent federal updates include borrower defense. So the Department of Education is set to cancel over $1 billion in student loan debt for students scammed by for-profit colleges like ITT Tech. For FEL loans in default, payment pause has been extended to commercially held FEL loans in default. For borrowers with disabilities, the department also secured additional relief for totally and permanently disabled borrowers, and the payment pause has been extended until February 1st, 2022. So we're seeing slowly, step by step, the federal government, the Department of Education is taking steps to, bring much needed relief, but we know that it's just one small step and there's a lot more for us to address. So it's important for us to keep fighting. This is a a movement that's growing. We're seeing momentum grow. We saw Chuck Schumer and Rep Pressley talk. We're seeing the momentum grow, and we continue to ask you to take action and to support us and to join us in this fight, because it's not going anywhere. On our social media page, sometimes I hear from borrowers who ask, is it worth it? Is there hope? I don't think there's any hope left, but the fact that we're still here and that we're fighting and we're seeing change is sign enough to me that there's hope and there's momentum, and we're not willing to give up on this fight. And we know that we're going to see progress moving forward. And so now I'll toss it over to Natalia Abrams to do the next section.
Thank you so much, Sabrina, and thank you for sharing your experience as a borrower. I will say I'm one of the lucky ones that got to pay it off, but I also, had a smaller debt amount. And, even though I've paid off my debt, I still want everyone to be able to have their debt canceled. And I think it's important that those that have never had debt or have had their debt speak up that, by canceling debt, we will help the society as a whole. We know that this whole workshop is around federal loans. Almost all borrowers have federal loans, but then you have private loans. We have a little bit of help for private loans, but the best thing to do is to check with your lender directly. There's not, repayment programs across the board with private lenders, but that's not to say there's nothing. So we really encourage you to check with your private lender. Check the balances and interest rates on your private loans. If you have multiple loan servicers, this could help you strategize and prioritize maybe the higher loan balance, or with the rest of the information we're going to tell you, prioritize, getting your federal loans in a repayment plan so you can tackle those awful private loans. And definitely be cautious about refinancing. If you have a federal loan now, be careful of the SoFis and Earnest out there that will convert your loan into a private loan, and then you won't be able to get the most generous repayment options that we're sharing with you today. So with that, we're going to go over the federal, and we're moving back to federal, the federal repayment loans. We're going to talk about the standard repayment plan, standard, as I say in quotations, income-driven repayment plans, and loans in default. So the standard plan, which is in quotes because I, like you, many people we know and work with have not been able to pay off in 10 years. It's almost a joke at this point when we talk to borrowers that are 20, 30 years into repayment. So you're supposed, they think that we should pay off these huge debt amounts within 10 years, but they do give some repayment plans to help us through that. We know these plans are not great. Unfortunately, they're all we have. That's why we are fighting to cancel student debt and keep payments on pause until that debt's canceled. But this is important to know if, if unfortunately loans are turned on February 1st, this information will help you. So income-driven repayment plans can make your monthly payment more affordable. This is based off your income and not your overall loan amount. That's really important because then you can look more to what you're making to pay off your loans versus that big, huge number for so many of us. They calculate monthly payments as a percentage of discretionary income, and they also base it on family size. And something wonderful we've learned from Lindsay at Savvy, who you'll hear from in a moment, but even if you are expecting, that counts as a dependent and could lower your payments. So who benefits from these plans? So people who have consistent lower incomes. Remember, this is based on your income, not your overall debt amount. So if you are making $0, you pay $0. This is really important for people who have lost their job or had a decrease in income due to COVID-19 or any reason. If you want to lock in lower payments for a year, we highly suggest you do that now and not as we get closer to February 1st. There's a lot of fear that it's going to be a big old mess and they're not going to be able to manage your loans properly. So if you are one of these people that have had that decrease in income or lost your job, we suggest after this workshop, go and sign up for a repayment plan if you haven't already. We do know that there have been FEL borrowers, those FFEL borrowers that have been paying this entire time. While many of us have had the benefit of not paying our loans, they have been paying for the last year and a half. these programs can and do benefit those FFEL borrowers. So let's take a look at an example of how this could help you. So for example, if you're making $0, as I said before, on that 10-year standard, you'd be paying $364 a month. On an income-driven repayment plan, you'd be paying $0. We do know that this extends your payment 20 to 25 years over the 10, but this helps keep you in good standing. And if you were with us earlier, as Kira Taylor said, you do not want to go into default. Default, destroys your credit, adds tons of money of compound interest to your loan. So this is your ticket to keep off default. And if you look, even if you make up to $75,000, you can still see a smaller payment, which could help you. So how do you do this? You need to submit an application. They are still taking applications right now. The loan servicers are not shut down. You can apply right now today. And you can enter a repayment plan, and you need to make sure to recertify within 12 months. There's an asterisk there because right now, if you have failed to recertify during this time of COVID, that's okay. You are still in the program. You are still in good standing. We are awaiting more news from the Department of Education of exactly when you will need to recertify. But in general, it's a yearly annual thing that you have to recertify to stay in these programs. So we want to warn you that there are scams out there. And unfortunately, a lot of these scams are now making people think that debt is already canceled, or they're saying, we know that Fed loan servicing is shut down and they're offering to take your loans from you or help you with your loans. Be very wary of anyone that, we don't suggest and work with, frankly, or that isn't the Department of Education. So, any of these scams would have a bait and switch, telling you of immediate loan forgiveness or deadlines approaching. There is no deadline in the way there is with healthcare. You can enroll in these programs at any time. If your income changes tomorrow, you can enroll in the program, or next month. And you can also notify them anytime your income's changed to lower that monthly payment. These scams typically involve loan consolidation, debt forgiveness in exchange for a fee. You should never have to pay lots of money to manage your student loan debt at all. Predatory practices include upfront fees and claiming to be the Department of Education. If you hear anyone claiming to be the Department of Education, please notify us at Student Debt Crisis Center. So what happens if your loan servicer, which we all know that they're pretty awful, gives you misinformation, directs you into the wrong place, doesn't help you out the way they're supposed to? Thank goodness with the change in administration, there is an answer. You can contact a wonderful person, a very hard worker in the fight to help student loan borrowers, federal student loan ombudsperson, Bonnie Littrell. And you can reach her at, it's a long email address for the few folks on the phone. It is FSA Ombudsman Office @ed.gov. And they can help you resolve discrepancies with loan balances and payments, explain loan interest collection charges, and identify options for resolving your service quality, default status, bankruptcy, income tax, refund offsets, and other concerns. This is a really valuable resource for borrowers, and I believe that that's being shared in the chat as well. So Kira Taylor talked a little bit about default. We don't want to go too into it, but we just want you to know what happens, that, technically one day after not paying your loan, you are delinquent. 90 days is when it gets reported to credit bureaus. We've heard from borrowers, that's really where that pain point starts to happen, because you then have trouble getting, a car loan or a home loan, or sometimes even a cell phone. And then after 270 days or 9 months, you are in federal loan default. And it's really important to enroll in these repayment programs so you can avoid that. So there are some alternative options. I'm not going to go deep into them right now, but we know that there are some people that, maybe make too much money, but they have still very high loan balances. There are things like extended repayment, graduated repayment, extended graduated repayment for you. In typical times, not during COVID, you can get 6-month forbearances. but be wary of forbearances and deferment that will compound and capitalize your loans. And you can also consolidate if you have an older loan as a fellow borrower, but also be wary of that and just know that that resets your clock. So if you've been in a repayment program for years, you need to weigh the options to see if it's worth it for you to consolidate into a direct student loan. So here is your handy dandy checklist. Learn what repayment plan works best for you, submit your application online, and recertify your income next year. Don't worry, you're not gonna have to remember all the different plans. We have a tool for you that's completely free of charge, will not take you to any pay service, that will help you manage and figure out the right repayment for you. And that's at app.bysavvy.com/register/borrowers. And that will help you find the right repayment program for you. And it's also being shared in the chat. Moving on. So just some quick FAQs that we get often. We've been doing these workshops, gosh, for years, I think 7 years of doing these workshops. And I can't tell you how much I want the debt canceled, so we don't have to do this anymore. But what should I do if my income family size changes before my recertification deadline? So you can recertify at any time. You right now are on a plan and you're paying $200, they decrease your hours, you can let them know right away and take down that monthly student loan payment. Will I pay taxes on the debt forgiven? Now, this is a new answer because recently there has been a new law passed in Congress that for the next 5 years, you will not have to pay taxes on the forgiven amount. We are fighting super hard to ensure that that stays over the lifetime versus just 5 years. Also, what other documentation can I submit for income? You can submit a pay stub that can be used as proof of income. And Lindsay will talk a little more about that as we go through the Savvy tool. So let's take some questions.
Great. So this is Cody jumping in again from Student Debt Crisis. Tons of great questions, a lot of them related to the issues related to income-driven repayment plans. So I know this is a lot of information. So hopefully we can get to the heart of some of this right now. So one of the questions is from Michael, and Michael wants to know, is there an upper income limit for benefiting from an income-driven repayment plan?
I think this is a great question for Lindsay, and if your camera's on.
Sure. Hey, Natalia and everyone. Hi, Michael.
Oh, you're muted.
Oh, can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. Hey, Michael. So great question. There really is no upper income limit, but for borrowers who do have a higher income, it's really going to come down to your debt to income ratio. So at some point, depending upon how much debt you have and what your income is, your payments actually could be higher on an income-driven repayment plan as opposed to on a standard plan, where it's based on your debt amount instead of your income. So, while for many people, those income-driven repayment plans can lower that monthly payment, it's really going to depend on that ratio. So for every borrower, it's going to be a little bit different. But we at Savvy have worked with doctors who are making over $400,000 a year and are on an income-driven repayment plan because, as we're about to learn a little bit later on, it's a requirement for the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. So like I said, there is no real upper limit, but it's going to really depend on that ratio. And for some, it might make more sense to be on a type of standard repayment plan versus an income-driven one. So hopefully that was helpful.
Yes, thank you so much, Lindsay.
All right, we're going to take one more question in this middle session, and then we'll compile a lot of the great questions for our end Q&A at the end of the presentation. This is actually a really important question. It comes up during every presentation. Do Parent Plus loans qualify for income-driven repayment plans?
I'm happy to take this one, Cody. So Parent Plus loans can qualify for income-driven repayment plans if they are consolidated. They need to be consolidated, and consolidation is a free federal process. And once consolidated, they are eligible for a type of income-driven repayment plan called income contingent repayment, or ICR. So they're only eligible for one type of income-driven repayment plan. Again, they can become eligible. They need to be consolidated in order to be eligible, and they would be eligible for the income contingent repayment plan.
Thank you, Lindsay. And we're seeing so many great comments and questions through the chat. You know, Beto, we agree with you. There has been way too much money made off interest alone, which is just another reason why we need to cancel student debt. But with that, we're going to move over to Lindsay and Ian at Savvy to talk about the, kind of only forgiveness or cancellation, that true cancellation that's out there right now for public service workers.
Great, thank you so much, Natalia. And it's such a pleasure to be here. You guys, I'm sure you know already at this point, but Natalia and Cody are probably the best advocates you could ever have in your corner. I mean, just putting on a day like today. And so it's a real honor to be with them. And Sabrina is a borrower just like you all, who joined the movement. And so it's just, this is really exciting to be a part of what they put together and to be with all of you here today. And I'm a student loan borrower myself. I have a little over $200,000 in student loan debt. So none of you are alone, as I hope you are imagining now. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the federal loan forgiveness programs, specifically one of the biggest ones, public service loan forgiveness. I'm going to walk you through the application process, what you need in order to be eligible. And then we're going to talk about some additional forgiveness programs and information related to forgiveness in general. So if we can go on to the next slide. So public service loan forgiveness. And I've heard a couple of you ask about what is PSLF in the chat. So PSLF stands for Public Service Loan Forgiveness. This program started in October of 2007. So if you have potentially any eligible employment from October 2007 to present, you could be potentially eligible for this program. And it is retroactive. Now, how do you achieve full forgiveness on the remainder of your loan balance? Well, you need to make 120 qualifying payments, okay? And that's basically, why people say 10 years, all right? But the important thing here is that these payments do not need to be consecutive. They just need to be cumulative. I'll repeat that again. They don't need to be consecutive. They just need to be cumulative. Okay. So if you worked in public service for a couple of years, accumulated, let's say 50 credits towards public service loan forgiveness, and then you went to work in the private sector for a little while, those credits don't go anywhere. They just pause. And then if you resume your eligibility in working in public service, you can continue accumulating those credits. So they don't need to be consecutive. I think that that's a really common misunderstanding about the program. Now, after you have made 120 of these cumulative payments, the remainder of your loan balance is eligible to be forgiven tax-free, okay? Tax-free. So again, this is 120 payments. That's why many people say 10 years, but it doesn't have to be 10 years exactly. And the program started in 2007. So that's October 2007 is the first year any potentially eligible employment would be applicable. On to the next slide. Okay, so when it comes to public service loan forgiveness, really it's about combining the benefits of an income-driven repayment plan plus the potential benefit of forgiveness. And that's how you're going to receive this maximum benefit. So through an income-driven repayment plan, we're hoping to minimize your monthly payment, right? And through public service loan forgiveness, we're hoping to maximize your forgiveness. And that combined is really sort of the maximum benefit of this program. So we're trying to minimize your monthly payment to maximize your forgiveness, and that's how it can work together. So the basics around PSLF and how you need to be eligible on this next slide. So I'm going to walk you through the criteria here and the steps you need to take in order to sort of confirm your eligibility. So first and foremost, your loan type. You need to have a direct federal loan in order to be eligible for public service loan forgiveness. The easiest way to tell if you have a direct loan is it will literally say the word direct or DL, which stands for direct loan, on your servicer statement or website. So direct loan, most important. Then you'd want to check if your employer qualifies. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk you through what are the qualifying employers exactly, but you need to be working for a qualifying employer in order to be eligible. Number 3, you need to be in a qualifying repayment plan. And we're going to talk about those in a bit more detail as well on the next slide. But the qualifying repayment plan is any type of income-driven repayment plan. All right, there are different types of income-driven repayment plans, but you just need to be on one of them. Doesn't matter which one in order to qualify. So really, if you think about sort of 3 things, your employment, your loan type, a direct loan, and your repayment plan, an income-driven repayment plan. Then what you want to do is you want to document this employment using what's called the PSLF employment certification form. This form is not required by the Department of Education, but highly suggested that you submit it every year so that you can essentially certify the past 12 months worth of eligible credits, so that year over year, you're gaining 12 more credits over 12 credits over 12 credits towards that 120. And once you reach the 120, you submit your final PSLF employment certification form. And that's essentially how you receive forgiveness. You need to be employed when you receive that final, or when you submit that final form. So I see so many questions flying through the chat, and I know this is all going to be confusing. And don't worry, we're going to take the time, and I'm going to show you actually the Savvy tool, or my colleague Ian is in a bit, where we're going to be able to work with many of you one-on-one to be able to get this help. So don't worry, you don't need to consume it all now. I realize it's overwhelming, but I'll repeat those 3 again. Having a direct loan, okay, working for a qualifying employer, and being in a qualifying repayment plan. Those are the 3 keys to public service loan forgiveness. Moving on to the next slide. All right, so let's talk about what does not, actually, I think we might have skipped one slide if we go back to what does qualify. There we go, okay, thanks guys. All right, so what type of loans do qualify for public service loan forgiveness? As I mentioned, the direct loans. It doesn't matter if they're subsidized or unsubsidized. Don't worry about it, doesn't matter, okay? Direct Grad Plus loans, direct Parent Plus loans can qualify, as well as direct consolidation loans. Now, one just quick note on those direct Parent Plus loans. In order to be eligible to qualify for public service loan forgiveness, they would need to be consolidated. Okay, that's the one loan type that needs to be consolidated in order to become eligible. Now let's talk about employers. How do you know if you have a qualifying employment? Well, it's all levels of government, federal, state, local, and tribal. Okay, that's what qualifies for public service loan forgiveness. You can also work for any 501c3 nonprofit, okay? That is a qualifying type of employer. There are also some other critical public service careers that could be eligible. And again, when we walk you through this free Savvy tool in a second, we're going to be able to show you how you can check those qualifications if need be. Last but not least, repayment plan. The eligible repayment plans are income-driven repayment plans. All right. Now we show on here the 10-year standard repayment plan. I'm going to talk in a second here about how there is a program called TEPSLF, which is for borrowers who were on that standard repayment plan. So I'm going to sort of hold on that for a second. But again, we've got direct loans, employer that qualifies, any type of government, any type of 501c3, and being on an income-driven repayment plan. Now let's talk about what does not qualify for PSLF on this next slide. All right, so what does not qualify for PSLF? Well, federal family education loans, or FFEL loans. Now, FFEL loans potentially could qualify for public service loan forgiveness through consolidation. Okay, again, I've mentioned consolidation a few times, but if you have one of those older FFEL loans, if you consolidate that loan, it could be eligible to qualify for public service loan forgiveness. Another type of loan that does not qualify are Perkins loans. Loans in default do not qualify. However, if they come back into good standing, they could qualify. And unfortunately, private student loans do not qualify for public service loan forgiveness. I have a combination of both private and federal, and unfortunately, private loans do not qualify and they can't be turned back into federal loans, all right? So those do not qualify. Now, employers that don't qualify, government contractors, okay? So if you work for the government, but you're a contractor, unfortunately, that does not qualify. Labor unions do not qualify. 501c4 nonprofits and political groups also do not qualify, as well as religious instruction. Now, repayment plans that don't qualify. Extended graduated and extended graduated repayment. These are all sort of variations of the standard plan of repayment. They do not qualify. Also, any months that you are in deferment, forbearance, or default, those months you are not eligible to receive credits towards the 120 you need for public service loan forgiveness. All right. So again, I know this is a lot, and my colleague Ian is about to sort of walk you through in a little bit how we've developed a free tool to hopefully help you check, but also for you all to be able to work one-on-one with student loan experts like myself and Natalia and Cody to be able to get the help you need. This is why we're here today. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So let's talk a little bit about public service loan forgiveness in the context of pandemic relief. And Vashetta, don't cry. Don't cry. I know it's overwhelming. I'm right there with you. But hopefully you see all these people who are on the chat and who all are in need of help, and it lifts you up. And we're all going to make sure that you get the help you need. I promise you that. So hopefully most of you are aware that back in March of 2020, when the CARES Act went into effect, payments were paused and interest was suspended. And that's been extended, as Sabrina mentioned, through the end of January 2022. So that'll be about 23 months, pretty much 2 years in which there have been no payments. Now, one of the great things about this payment pause, okay, maybe the silver lining of COVID, if there is any, is that during this payment pause, they are allowing borrowers who are eligible to accumulate credits towards public service loan forgiveness. So that means those 2 years of non-payments can count as 2 years towards the 10 years ultimately that you need to get your loans forgiven. That's huge, okay? And this is retroactive, Regina, to answer your question as I see it coming through. So like I said, that is about 2 years worth of credits that borrowers who are eligible are able to receive towards public service loan forgiveness during this time without having had to make a payment at all. And I've seen many borrowers who actually continued making payments during this time because they thought that they needed to in order to be eligible for public service loan forgiveness, and that's not the case. So again, that's a huge opportunity for many, many borrowers. And we're going to show you the Savvy tool in a little bit that can hopefully help you to take advantage of this particular sort of partial student loan forgiveness for those that are eligible. Moving on. So I had mentioned a little bit earlier something called TEPSLF. It's called Temporary Expanded PSLF. This was essentially a fund of money set aside by Congress a couple of years ago for borrowers who, for lack of a better term, had sort of been screwed over by this process. TEPSLF is for borrowers who have direct loans, okay, work for a qualifying employer, but were not on the right repayment plan. They were on the standard repayment plan, which basically is the 10-year repayment plan, okay? So they were on that standard repayment plan. If that was you, so you have to have the right type of loan, you have to work for a qualifying employer, but you are paying your loans back on the standard plan, you could be eligible for TEPSLF if you've made 120 payments. Now, this is a limited fund. So when the money runs out, unless Congress re-ups that fund, it's done. So for those borrowers who think that they might be eligible, please reach out to us right away because we can help you to submit that application. We've seen so many borrowers actually receive TEPSLF Actually, just last week, we helped a teacher who received $90,000 in TEPSLF forgiveness. So we're going to make sure you have all of our contact information. And as I said, Ian's going to show you the tool where you can get in touch with our support team to be able to help you out with this type of application. All right, moving on to another type of forgiveness, teacher loan forgiveness. So for any teachers out there, feel free to raise your hand to shout out in the chat. We are so lucky to work with NEA, which is the largest teachers union in the country. Obviously, we work with teachers every single day. There is a special type of loan forgiveness program called teacher loan forgiveness, or TLF. And essentially, you can either have $5,000 or a maximum of $17,500 forgiven on your loans, depending upon your eligibility. You need to work for 5 consecutive years in a Title I school or low income school or educational agency in order to qualify. For the $5,000, you just need to work in an elementary or secondary school as a full-time, highly qualified teacher. For the $17,500, you need to be a STEM teacher, math, science, or special education only, and work in a secondary school. So there are a couple different qualifications here, and the Savvy tool actually can help you to identify if you are a teacher, if your district is eligible, if you are eligible, and help you dig into that in more detail. Moving on to the next slide. There are other types of career-specific loan forgiveness programs out there. Programs for healthcare professionals, including nurses, physicians, pharmacists, dental professionals, and mental health professionals. Now, oftentimes the program eligibility is going to vary based on what state you live in. So if you have any questions about that, I highly encourage you to reach out to us and we can help identify if you could be eligible for any of those programs. There are also, on this next slide, different types of forgiveness, cancellation, and discharge. So if we can move on to the next one. Perfect. So many of you have been asking about this. There are sort of an array of different forgiveness, cancellation, and discharge related programs. There's total and permanent disability discharge for those that are eligible, closed school discharge, defense to repayment, borrowers who had been sort of defrauded by their schools, unpaid refund, death discharge for those borrowers who have passed, and false certification of eligibility. So we're not going to go into too much detail on this workshop now, but if you have any questions about any of these programs, please feel free to reach out to us and we'll be able to help to see if you're eligible and pursue those if you need to. All right, so I know that was a lot. So we're going to sort of regroup here with the loan forgiveness checklist. So first and foremost, confirming you have a qualifying loan. And like I said, my colleague Ian in a second here is going to talk to you about how we've developed a free tool for you all to use to be able to do that. You also then want to make sure you're enrolled in a qualifying repayment plan, okay, an income-driven repayment plan specifically. Then you're going to want to verify employer qualification and keep that documentation. Make sure to keep that documentation, okay? And then you're going to want to continue to work full-time in order to complete those 120 payments. This is for public service loan forgiveness. Now, a few FAQs to sort of close us out here on this next slide. And the link to the Savvy chat I know is in the chat right now, or the link to the Savvy site I believe is in the chat right now. So here are some of the common questions that I see coming through around public service loan forgiveness. So first of all, can you double up on payments and earn 2 credits a month? The answer is no, you cannot, unfortunately. You must make 120 payments and you can't make 2 payments a month and have it count towards 2 credits. So 1 payment per month, 120 months essentially. But again, they don't need to be consecutive, they just need to be cumulative. Next question, how do I check how many PSLF credits I have? So the way in which you can check this is by submitting what's called an employment certification form, that public service loan forgiveness employment certification form. That gets signed off by you, the borrower. It gets signed off by your employer, basically certifying the duration of your employment. And then after you submitting that to your servicer, after certification, you can contact your servicer to confirm your credits. Okay, you can find that form, I know, on the Department of Education, Christy, who asked that website, the Department of Ed website. And we also have it here for you at Savvy. We're happy to send that to you as well. Last question here. If I've been working in public service and I'm just finding out about this program, can those years count? The answer is yes, they can. This program is retroactive. You can apply to certify that employment, anything from October of 2007 to current. You can apply to have that certified. Now, again, it's going to depend on what loan type you have and what repayment plan you are on, but that employment could still count. All right. And the last thing I just want to say on this before I hand it over to Ian to talk about the Savvy tool that hopefully can help so many of you that it looks like are in need, is that while there is a sort of 2% acceptance rate on this program, we're only going to see that exponentially increase over the years. The program started in 2007. So 2017 was the first year, 10 years later, that borrowers could apply. And many borrowers had no idea that you needed to have a direct loan or you needed to be on a certain type of repayment plan, and to no fault of their own. I mean, again, they were told if you work in public service, that was the promise, right? So it's very, very frustrating. But the more that borrowers become aware of these qualifications and what's necessary in order to be eligible, we at Savvy are building a program to help you understand this and get enrolled. The more we are seeing borrowers get that forgiveness, and we're only going to see more continue to get it in the coming years. So with that being said, I will turn it over to my colleague, Ian, who's going to talk to you about this free tool that can help you to actually understand your debt and get enrolled in things like public service loan forgiveness. Ian, do we have you?
Yes, I am here. Thanks for all the great information, Lindsay. You know, it's hard to go through the entirety of, student loans 101 in, 15, 20 minutes here. So we definitely will have time after this last portion of the presentation to answer tons of questions. There's a lot of wonderful questions coming in, so do keep those coming. The great part too about this presentation, the more we know, the better we make decisions, the better we advocate, the better we work together. Our service is, partnered with Student Debt Crisis, also helps you make the best decisions, and it does so much of it digitally and automatically for you. So you always have a guide, on your side, whether that's, us here on these workshops, whether that's our whole, customer support team at Savvy that is 24/7 available to you, whether that's a digital tool that helps you, build these maps and make decisions, that are informed and the best for your financial picture. We want to make sure we give you all the tools and resources possible. So that is, mainly what Savvy is. As a company, on the next slide, we are a public benefit corporation, which means we are here and we exist to serve and help the public good. Everyone, public benefit corporations, you think of those as organizations that are doing really, really good work, helping save the environment, helping people with debt, et cetera. So that is our premise here. We were founded by student loan policy experts and advocates that have decades of experience in this, whether that was working at the White House, working on Obama's 2008 campaign, launching nonprofits, testifying to Congress, all of that kind of work. They knew, the intimate picture of student loans and how confusing and hard they were to navigate. And while we need to continue to advocate for policy changes, advocate for cancellation, advocate for reform, we know that people, like me, I have close to $70,000 in student loans, and 46 million other people, and like all of you today, we have this debt and we need to know what to do with it, how to best manage it, and do that all in the interim here. So this is an immediate solution that we have built on a technology platform to be able to help as many people as possible. And like I said, it's built by people that know the system in and out very well, supported by wonderful advocates like Student Debt Crisis Center, and has a whole, team of support to help you through this process as well. Because there are, so many intimate things that technology can't solve all of our problems. So we do still have a whole team of people available for you. The next slide here is a couple examples of just the things that we will be able to help you do for no cost due to our partnership together with Student Debt Crisis. These features are available 100% for free to you on our website. I believe that link is in the chat, but we can go ahead and keep putting that in there. It is app.bysavvy.com/register/borrowers. So all of those, rules and regulations that Lindsay just ran through for public service loan forgiveness, for teacher loan forgiveness, it'd, check all those rules for you based on the information you put in and let you know, good to go, or, hey, let's get all set up. Here's your checklist of things you need to do and change. You'll be able to see all those kind of personalized options. It'll give you the best kind of map forward to say, you can use this plan to save the most amount of money per month. All of that paperwork that is usually on your own, you would have to download it, print it out, use ink and pen and paper, and fax it back in. All of that is done digitally. That helps us avoid what we call an application abyss. When you're faxing papers in and you're not sure if they got them, if they received it, if they processed it. Meanwhile, that's important things like your student loans on the line, monthly payments that could be adding up or aren't, all relying on a fax in 2021 is a little ridiculous. So we do that all digitally. There's annual reminders that we will send you, to keep you up to date so that you don't fall out of the program or fall out of regulations in this process. So that is super helpful. And as well, being based in Washington, D.C., we're always here. Our team of policy experts is watching for policy changes and new things happening on the Hill, as well as advocating alongside the folks at Student Debt Crisis Center. So you will be the first to know from both of us when big things happen that affect your loans, rather than having to follow the news headlines of the day. And last but not least, like I've alluded to a couple of times, there is a whole team of one-on-one support staff. Over half of our company at the moment is all one-on-one support staff that you would be able to email, call, chat, have that custom kind of walkthrough to make sure that your student loans are good, get kind of a student loan checkup, and that you are back on track and ready for repayment and everything else. I think we're going to run through just a couple of screenshots here, just so there are no surprises and you know what you're getting into when you go to this website. Nothing is too confusing looking. The first page here that we'll see, you can get to by bookmarking the link that is in the chat. It is app.bysavvy.com/register/borrowers. This gets you to the free version of the site with our Student Debt Crisis partnership. There's nothing too crazy here in this form. It's your name, email, and password is all. We're not going to sell that information. We're not going to market it. It is really just for the privacy and security of you putting in your loan information. Once you get logged in, you'll see your Savvy dashboard on the next slide here. That is, you can think of this as your kind of student loan hub, your student loan central location here. So you'll be able to join additional workshops like this. You'll always be able to contact support, contact an expert. Once you add your loans, sync them over and give us those pieces of information, you'll be able to see, for example, your 120 payments towards public service loan forgiveness add up. You'll be able to see all your loans in one spot. So even if you're like me and have federal and private loans, you can see those all together in one area, everything like that. So this is kind of your central hub. If you were to submit an income-driven application with us, you'll be able to see here when it was accepted, when it was sent, all of that digitally as well. So you're not just putting a piece of paper in the fax machine and hoping for the best. If we go ahead and hit continue application here, it's going to look maybe something like a tax software or online banking that you're familiar with. There's just a handful of questions that help us help you save money. So everything in here is designed to work in your benefit. These questions like where you live can help unlock local savings options, whether that's Illinois, California, Texas, or anywhere else. Lots of states have options for student loans. For example, if you're in Illinois and buying a home for the first time, you're eligible for $30,000 of loan forgiveness from the state of Illinois. So just, answering questions like that helps us best match you with the features available. Another, example here of these questions is how many dependents you have, because every child dependent that you have, you save $50 per month on your student loan payment on an income-driven repayment plan. So there's all sorts of kind of rules and regulations here that you are able to unlock, simply knowing better and doing better here. As we keep going through the next slides in the application, it will get to a point here where you have to sync your loans. You're welcome to sync them or manually type them in. Syncing is a very quick feature that uses Plaid. So if you have a Venmo account or really any other online financial account, it is likely that you've used Plaid before. What it does is draws a secure connection between online accounts. So this gives us the most up-to-date informed snapshot of your student loan picture. So we'll be able to see, how many payments you've made so that you're able to make sure that we're counting all of the correct credits and payments, and retroactively doing all of that, like Lindsay has said. That's what gives us that ability and feature to do so. Once you finish syncing with Plaid, you'll get your kind of customized map here of all the different options available for you. So you can see in this example, we're saving, I think, maybe $200 something per month, it looks like in the screenshot. And it gives us what our estimated forgiveness amount is. So it maps that out. It says we have 5 years until forgiveness because we put in, some past work that we've done at a eligible public service loan forgiveness employer. And it shows us all the different options. So whether we do an income-driven plan or another option, this helps you see it all in one spot in one feature. At this point, you're able to, sign up and hit continue and go through that plan, doing that all digital. You're always welcome at any point in time to reach out to our customer support team and chat with them live, send them an email. We have a whole help center. So if you need to reference back, any of the things we've discussed here today, you're welcome to read through that as well. It's in plain English. It's not in, bureaucratic Department of Ed speak on their website. So this will hopefully be helpful in navigating and guiding you on the best decisions for your student loans. And I know that was a lot once again, so we do have time here to take questions and hopefully provide any additional details that I might have missed.
Great, thank you so much, Ian.
Yeah, there's so many great questions. Honestly, there's been so many good ones. It's been hard to keep track. So we're going to try to address as many of them as we can. I think some of the questions are quite related as well. So we'll hopefully check off as much as possible. I do want to start just because we just wrapped up the information about the Savvy tool. I want to just kick this to the Savvy team to answer the question that we're seeing coming up, which is this tool free for folks on today's call?
Sure, I can take that one, Cody. Yes, it is absolutely free through our great partnership with Student Debt Crisis Center. We are able to provide this tool and our expert support team and our resources to all of you at no cost, and there never will be a cost. So we're really excited about that. And I just wanted, Cody, I saw some questions coming in asking how people can contact us. If we can actually go back one screen to the previous one, if possible. Great. So if you create your free Savvy account, on the bottom right-hand corner of every page in the tool is a little green support button, or on the left-hand side, there's also that says need some help. You can start a message with our support team. You can send them a message and set up a one-on-one consultation or chat, and they'll be able to help you. So for those of you who are looking for something one-on-one, you're able to do it there. Or you can send us an email, and I put our email in the chat as well. So we really just want to be here to be able to help you and answer your questions in the best way we can. Back to you, Cody.
Well, and real quick, as Ian said, we're just seeing so much through the chat that you can select any of the options. It will never take you to a paid site, as Lindsay mentioned, due to our partnership. This is something we want to provide you for free. Also, make sure to use the link provided because this is a special free service for you all. It's not something you can just go Google Savvy and find it. You do need to use the app.buysavvy.com/register/borrowers. Cody?
Great. Let's jump in with a question from Julianne. Julianne is one of the borrowers that's been working in public service for a long time and is just finding out today about public service loan forgiveness. So does any of the time prior to today qualify? So pretty much, can you retroactively apply for a program you just found out about today?
Sure, great question. And the answer is yes. So really any employment from when the program started October 1 of 2007 to present is fair game. Now, the only sort of stipulations here or that you're going to need to make sure that you have the other eligibility requirements in place. So you would have needed to have had a direct loan, as well as been on an income-driven repayment plan, or if potentially you were on a standard plan, you could qualify for TEPSLF. So again, it's really those three things: your employment, your loan type, and your repayment plan. And it is retroactive. You can go back in time and get that to qualify.
Great. And I just, want to add that if you're also just finding out about it, you will, and you've been working in public service all of this time during the pandemic, is essentially, free. Like you'll get every single month during the pandemic if you have been working, even if you're just registering today.
Maybe there's an opportunity here to clarify. I see someone's asking about FFEL loans. These are the older types of federal loans that exist. Can we just provide a little extra context and clarity about why certain FFEL loans don't qualify for public service loan forgiveness? And if you have one of these loans, what can you do to maybe qualify in the future?
Sure, happy to take this, Cody. So actually all FFEL loans, not even just certain types, but all FFEL loans in their current state as a FFEL loan are not eligible for the public service loan forgiveness program. I'm not sure why they were excluded and why only direct loans count. It stinks. And I know so many borrowers who worked 10 plus years in public service and found out that because they had a FFEL loan, this technicality, that none of those years were eligible. And it's really, really frustrating and heartbreaking. We see this all the time. The way that you can get your FFEL loan to potentially qualify for public service loan forgiveness is through consolidation. Consolidation being, again, a free federal process by which you are essentially creating a new direct loan. But here's the thing. Only payments and service made after that point of consolidation are eligible to count towards the 120 you need to qualify for public service loan forgiveness. So once you consolidate that loan, it'll be about 10 years, from that point in which you'd be eligible. So really, I think the important point here being the earliest you can identify your loan type in your repayment process, the better, because if it is a loan type that would require corrective action like a FFEL loan, you'd want to make that obviously as early on as possible so you're not sacrificing potentially eligible months and years of payment and service. So I hope that was helpful.
Thank you, Lindsay. And just to clarify, we are saying FFEL loans, that's the federal family education loans, not Fed loan. I know there's a lot of different terminology, but Fed loan, which the loan servicer is, going to be no longer next year, that doesn't impact any of your status with your months towards PSLF. Fed loan does count. FFEL or FFEL loan does not, and that's what Lindsay was just discussing.
Thanks, Natalia.
Yeah, maybe a section opportunity to just jump in on that. What is going on with Fed Loan, the company that services student loans? Because I know a lot of people interested in public service loan forgiveness should be working with this company, and they're no longer going to exist very soon. So there's a lot of questions, I think, up in the air, but is there anything we can talk about now that could provide any level of clarity?
Yes, Lindsay, what are you telling borrowers that, have Fed Loan as their servicer right now while we await more concrete information?
Sure. So, as I think we talked about earlier in the presentation, borrowers who have Fed loan are being transitioned to other servicers in the coming months. They're not renewing their contract as of the end of this year. And so we are telling borrowers to make sure that their contact information is updated with Fed loan right now, so that they are aware and are able to receive communication about where their loans will be transferred to what other servicer. We have unfortunately not heard any other communications coming from the Department of Ed or other sort of regulatory agencies around how this process will work, specifically around public service loan forgiveness. But we will communicate that to the borrowers that we work with as soon as we do. But we want to make sure that you all are aware of that who have Fed loan. Nothing will change about your loans, but they'll just be transferred to a new servicer. But we are not sure what that servicer or multiple servicers, what that will look like. Cody, Natalia, I don't know if you guys have heard anything differently on your end.
So it's going to sound a little weird, but there is a well-known advocate, Betsy Mayotte, who did a Reddit thread. And from there, we are hearing that Mohia is going to be taking over the loans. So that is in motion. I know that's very odd to say it that way, but that's a very trusted source. Betsy Mayotte, not necessarily Reddit. So that is what we are hearing. Please stay tuned. The moment we get more concrete information, we will be doing multiples of these workshops leading into the payment pause while actively fighting to cancel debt and make sure payments don't go off pause.
Yeah.
Natalia, can you type that acronym in the chat maybe, or one of you, or say it out loud?
Drop this in for you all. There was some guess that Mohila would possibly be the servicer because they share some of the same technologies that FedLoan does.
Right.
So the transition would ideally be very seamless and smooth. The technologies would look the same. But I just wanted to underline what Natalia said. We as a group, the folks at Savvy, our team at SDCC, went into today's workshop very diligent, knowing that we wanted to provide up-to-date information. And it's unfortunate that a lot of the information related to some of these transitions isn't clear yet. So as Natalia said, stay tuned, because that is top of our priority list, which is to get information out to you all as soon as we know and as soon as we actually have solid concrete information. And so we will be communicating with folks very publicly and vocally once we have that information. I want to take a moment to address something that came up throughout actually today's entire session. And that was this idea that public service loan forgiveness exists, but that very few people have actually had their loans forgiven. That has been a challenge for us, I think a communications challenge for many years. Natalia, maybe you can clarify, what does this mean? What's actually going on with public service loan forgiveness?
Okay, so it exists. I know it's really easy to just think it's a scam. I just want to quickly say, Beto, I agree. I wish the president was reading this chat as well, because they messed it up big time, right? Charlie mentioned 32 people have received debt forgiveness. And I think now for public service loan forgiveness, it's in the hundreds. So much of that was the folks with the older loans, with those FFEL loans that, probably called their servicer monthly, yearly to double check they were in the right program, only to find out 10 years later that they were not. If you have a direct loan, if your loans have been issued after 2010, you have a direct loan. If you have been working diligently in public service for the 10 years or 120 qualifying payments, then you will get forgiveness. We expect to see much more cancellation for public service workers in the future. There's also right now, and we'll hear about it in the afternoon workshop, a request for information to improve the public service loan forgiveness, to get rid of this whole FFEL direct loan issue and make it able to qualify for all. So while we're actively, and I've been saying this in the chat over and over again, working to cancel student debt, we are also working on these other ways that we can cancel debt and make your experience as a student loan borrower much better, because as you can see in the chat, this is a struggle for so many, and we're here to help as much as we can.
There's some more great questions from so many different topics. I want to address something we talked about earlier on in the workshop. This is a question from Chrissy, and Chrissy wanted to know, if you have a private loan, but you want to access all these great federal programs, is there anything that you can do?
Yeah, I'm happy to take this one. So unfortunately, they're not going to be eligible, and by they I mean private loans are not eligible for some of the programs we talked about here today, like income-driven repayment or public service loan forgiveness. However, my recommendation would be, and because private loans will differ from lender to lender, to reach out to your private lender directly. And this is something we're happy to help you with here at Savvy. We actually can get on the phone with you and the lender to figure out what options and programs they might be providing. Oftentimes there are things like interest-only payments. And I know during the pandemic, they've offered some forbearance. So if you are in distress, in particular as a private loan borrower, again, I highly recommend reaching out to your private lender to see what options might be available to you as far as lowering those monthly payments. And again, if you are in distress, they offer things like forbearance right now because of COVID. That would be my best bet. Natalia, Cody, I don't know if you have anything else to add there.
I would just add something that's been a problem for advocates for years, which is, this problem that there's millions of people with student loans that they get from a bank that have a completely different set of rules. For those that are on today's call, listening on YouTube or following on Twitter, we hear you when you say nothing's being done for private student loans. It is at the top of our priority list to make sure that private student loans are included in all of the policies we fight for in Washington. It has been an obstacle to ensure that that's the case. But there have been important victories. Here in California during the pandemic, there was relief. That was huge. And that actually caught fire where there was, over a dozen states providing relief for private student loans. So that's just one example. So we definitely hear you. We wish we could, provide guided support for private student loan borrowers. It's challenging, but we are advocating for you and you are heard.
And real quick, I'm just seeing about the MOHELA, MOHELA, that it will be a federal loan servicer like FedLoan. It should be seamless. I stress the word should, something that you really want to do. And I hate that we as borrowers have to do the work, but make sure to keep your paperwork, your pay stubs, everything in order during this time. But it should feel seamless to you as the borrower.
I got a question from Bermuda. Bermuda is someone who's already enrolled in one of these income-driven repayment plans. And Bermuda is concerned because the IDR plan still really isn't enough to make her living situation more affordable. We've talked about this for years, so Natalia, maybe you want to jump in and kind of explain, what are the limitations to an IDR program and they're imperfect, but why do we still promote them even though they're not effective for everyone?
Number one goal is to keep you all out of default while we collectively fight to cancel student debt. That we do know they're imperfect. It adds interest. It extends your repayment program to 20 or 25 years. But we hear from borrowers all the time that can't wait until we cancel student debt. They can't make payments tomorrow and they don't want to have their credit report ruined or not be able to get a home, which is out of reach for so many of us. But default is just so bad. So we really try hard to keep you out of default. That's why we talk about these programs. It's not that we're not actively always trying to fight to cancel student debt. It's just many, many borrowers do not have the privilege of waiting.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, there's a huge information gap. We always talk about it here at Student Debt Crisis. It's why we host these workshops. There are millions of people who can benefit from these programs, even if they're not perfect, that just don't know they exist. So it is our mission to get that information out, to hopefully, provide an avenue for the people that can benefit. And we recognize there's still going to be people facing serious challenges. And for you all, we're just going to keep fighting and advocating for more substantive change. So it's a two-pronged mission, giving people information for those that will help and fighting for bold change for those that aren't currently helped by the existing system.
On that information gap, I think pre-pandemic, we don't really have the stats post, but there was only 8 million borrowers out of the 45 million borrowers that were on these programs. We do these workshops all the time and hear from borrowers that had no idea this existed. My favorite day is when I talk to somebody in PSLF that's many years in and didn't realize it, and they're only a few months or a few years away from debt cancellation. So, share this information with people It's really important. In order to help us advocate and fight to cancel debt, we want you to take care of your own debt situation first, so you're more clear-minded to help us in the fight.
I want to address a question here also from Robin. And Robin was asking, if you're an older borrower and your income comes from Social Security, is your Social Security income vulnerable if you fall into student loan default? And I want to take an opportunity to address this because what we constantly talk about here at Student Debt Crisis Center is that this is a multi-generational issue and that older borrowers are impacted, and they're impacted in unique ways. So we know that older student loan borrowers is the fastest growing group of borrowers. And we also know that they're most likely to fall into default. And these are either parents, grandparents, or family members who co-signed for someone's loan, or it's someone who went to school themselves. It's a very diverse group. And what we have found is that borrowers who fall into default and who are older are also extremely vulnerable to having their Social Security garnished or withheld by the federal government to pay back their student loans. So it's a serious risk. And Senator Elizabeth Warren, who's going to join us later this afternoon, always talks about this as a critical issue because for older borrowers who do have their Social Security garnished, a large majority of them are pushed under the poverty guideline. They're pushed into poverty because it's immoral and it's wrong, but it's a real concern. The good news is, particularly right now, that the COVID-19 relief for federal student loans has put this on pause. So if you have had your Social Security garnished in the past, or you would have had your Social Security garnished during this year, that has been on pause since March of last year as part of the relief for people impacted by the pandemic. So it's something that's on pause. It kind of doesn't exist currently, but it's part of the system and will be turned back on possibly when payments resume.
And thank you all for helping each other in the chat. I'm so sorry, Yolanda and Evelyn, that you have experienced this. You're absolutely right. Unfortunately, you were sold a lie that Social Security was protected for you, but in fact, they can take 15% of your Social Security, which we know for those on Social Security, you can't afford an extra dime. Another reason why we talk about these repayment programs. If you are making $0, you pay $0. You could be in this program for the rest of your life and never pay another dime again. It's really imperative to know about this. If you had fallen into default, there is something called default rehabilitation. It's a complicated process, which is why we don't go into it here, but that is something that Savvy can help you with so you can get into good standing and then get into one of those repayment programs and stop having that 15% taken out of your paycheck every month.
Yeah, Natalia, I just want to say to those borrowers who might be in default or experiencing that, I'm putting our email address in the chat. Please, please, please reach out to us so that we can set up a phone call with you and get the rehabilitation process started. And we actually call the collections agency with you and walk you through the process. So I put the email in the chat for anyone who needs it. Don't hesitate to reach out. We really want to be there to help you all.
Lindsay, I want to send another question your way because I saw you answer it for Michael, but I know other people will want to know this. And so earlier in the chat, Michael asked if he should wait for payments to resume in February to enroll in one of these affordable income-driven repayment plans. I thought you gave him some good advice as to what to consider. So if you could share that with everyone, I think it'd be incredibly helpful.
Sure. So to Michael and to any others out there who are wondering whether they should wait or not, if you've experienced any type of drop in income, no matter how significant or insignificant, I highly encourage you to go through the process of submitting an income-driven repayment plan now, while your income is at whatever level it is now, so that you can lock in the lowest monthly possible payment under that income now. When payments resume, it will resume under that payment amount, rather than wait and let's say potentially your income goes back up again, you get a job again perhaps, and then it will have to be based on that income amount. So if you've experienced, Michael had said, my income isn't consistent right now, should I wait until it's more consistent? And I in fact said, actually, no, you want to take advantage of potentially a lower income now to be able to resubmit that application, like I said, to lock in the lower income amount. And to Melody, I just saw who asked, are expenses considered in this income? They're not. They're looking at your adjusted gross income. So that's before taxes, unfortunately. And the two pieces of income documentation that you can use are either your most recent tax return or a pay stub from the past 90 days. But if you are unemployed, there's absolutely no supporting documentation needed. You can submit that IDR, income-driven repayment application, right away and lock in a $0 monthly payment now if you are unemployed. So hopefully that was helpful to all of you. Again, sort of the headline here is if your income is lower right now, you've experienced any type of income instability or decrease, you'd want to resubmit that income-driven repayment plan application now to lock in the lowest monthly payment possible.
We had a question at the very beginning of the call when Sabrina at Team SDCC was sharing her personal story, and I resonated with her story, and so did a bunch of folks in the chat, because she's a first-generation college student. You know, my family came from Armenia, and you know, education was at the top of the list, but I was the first in my family to go to school, and a bunch of other folks raised their hand and said, I am also a first-generation student. And so what Robin wanted to know is, you know, as someone who's a first-generation college student and doesn't know about the federal financial aid system and how to pay for college, you know, do we have just any broad advice for someone who just feels lost? And I'm happy to just kick us off because I have this experience, and I open the floor to everyone else as well. You know, Robin, I think step one, you're already doing the right thing by being here on a clinic. The reason that first-generation college students have such a difficult time paying for college, you know, among many other like systemic issues when it comes to wealth and things like that, is the fact that many of us don't have the information available to us. So no one in my family had gone to college. I didn't know the infrastructures in place to help me pay for college, to access grants, to, you know, start my repayment journey in the right place. So what that means, unfortunately, is that we have to put in the work to educate ourselves so that we know our rights, we know our options, and we can take advantage of it. And so coming to a clinic like this, using the Savvy tool, reading up on your rights at the Department of Education's website, it's the best way to equip yourself with important information so that when you contact your student loan company or a debt relief scam calls you, you feel confident that you understand your rights and your options. And that to me is the best advice. It means extra work on our end, but it can save us a lot in the long run.
I think this is a great place, if Sabrina's still on, to help close us out and also share other ways that you can kind of take action and get involved. Sabrina, do we still have you?
Yes, I'm here. Cody, if you could show the next slide. So as I touched upon earlier, sharing your story is one of the most impactful ways that we can really get the message across to people in Washington, to our local leaders, to lawmakers, policymakers. It's very important. And so having been someone who didn't really know about the student debt crisis, and then, you know, I ended up following student debt crisis, signing a petition, and then, you know, getting involved that way, and then getting to speak with Senators Chuck Schumer, Elizabeth Warren, and even Secretary Miguel Cardona, I really saw how important it was that I shared my story. So if you want to share your story, we're dropping the link in the chat now, so you can go there and share it. If you haven't done so already, if there are actions you can take, there are petitions, there are letters, it's also on our website and you can find it there. It's very important. We thank you for sharing your story. It means a lot to us. We read your stories as well. We try and do what we can to help you as well, because that's our priorities, to bring your voices, to bring your stories, and bringing awareness to this issue. And we believe that the student debt crisis will be solved and that debt will be canceled. And I just want to thank you all for coming and joining us today. And I want to invite you to come back at 5 p.m. Eastern time, when Senator Elizabeth Warren will be here. Alyssa Milano will be moderating, and we'll also have a panel on mental health, as well as another student loan help clinic if you missed any information. And we'll also be posting on our YouTube channel. If you're worried about missing any information or you want to see anything again, feel free to visit us there. Thank you again, and we hope to see you all at 5.
Thank you all so much. And please send your questions to us or join us for the evening workshop. We really appreciate it. Thank you.